It is the morning of June 5th, 1967. At air bases scattered across the Sinai Peninsula and the Nile Delta, nearly 300 Egyptian combat aircraft sit on their tarmacs. MiG-21 interceptors, MiG-19 fighters, Tupolev Tu 16 bombers, Ilyushin Il-28 light bombers, the largest and most modern air force in the Arab world, supplied and trained by the Soviet Union. Their pilots have not yet received their morning briefings. The engines are cold. Ground crews move between the aircraft in the routine of an ordinary day. In less than 3 hours, the overwhelming majority of these machines will be burning wreckage. 200 miles to the northeast, on the runways of Israeli air bases, almost the entire combat strength of the Israeli Air Force is already airborne or taxiing for takeoff. Nearly 200 aircraft, French-built Mirage 3s, Super Mystères, Ouragans, Mystère 4s, and Vautour bombers, are flying low over the Mediterranean, some barely 60 feet above the waves, beneath Egyptian radar coverage, converging on 11 Egyptian airfields simultaneously. The pilots have rehearsed this mission for months. Every target has been photographed, studied, and assigned. Every approach vector, every timing interval, every bomb load has been calculated to the minute. What is about to happen will not be a battle. It will be a coordinated destruction, and it will reshape the entire balance of power in the Middle East in a single morning. But before we reach that moment, we need to understand how the region arrived at this point, and why the outcome of the Six-Day War was not the miracle it is often made to seem. Because the standard telling of this conflict, in which a tiny, outnumbered nation defeated 3 Arab armies in less than a week, tends to emphasize courage, improvisation, and the near-mystical fighting spirit of the Israeli soldier. And while none of that is untrue, it conceals the real reason Israel won so completely and so quickly. The decisive factor was not a single hero or a secret weapon, it was preparation. Specifically, it was years of institutional preparation, detailed intelligence collection, relentless pilot training, precise logistical planning, and a doctrine of preemptive initiative built into every level of command, stacked against Arab forces that were larger on paper but structurally disorganized, poorly coordinated between nations, and operating under political leadership that consistently prioritized rhetoric over readiness. That is the story of the Six-Day War. Not a story of miracles, but a story of what happens when one side treats war as an operational problem to be solved through planning, and the other treats it as a political instrument to be brandished through speeches. To understand June 1967, you have to go back to the geography. Israel, in 1967, is a country roughly the size of New Jersey. Its width at the narrowest point near the coastal city of Netanya is just 9 miles. 9 miles from the Jordanian border to the Mediterranean Sea. A single armoured thrust at that point could cut the country in half in under an hour. To the south, Egypt controls the Sinai Peninsula, a vast desert buffer between the Suez Canal and Israel's Negev region. To the north, Syria holds the Golan Heights, a volcanic plateau that rises sharply above the Israeli farming communities in the Galilee below. And to the east, Jordan controls the West Bank, including the eastern half of Jerusalem, and a ridgeline that overlooks Israel's main population centres on the coastal plain. This is a country surrounded on 3 sides by states that have publicly and repeatedly committed to its destruction, and this is not diplomatic manoeuvring or political posturing for domestic audiences. The leaders of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan have stated in clear terms, in public broadcasts at the United Nations and in military communiques, that their goal is the elimination of the State of Israel. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, the most powerful and charismatic Arab leader of his generation, has built his entire political identity around pan-Arab nationalism and opposition to Israel. He nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, survived a combined British, French, and Israeli invasion, and emerged from that crisis as the undisputed leader of the Arab world. By 1967, he commands an army of over 200,000 men, more than 1,000 tanks, many of them modern Soviet T-54s and T-55s, and that air force of nearly 300 combat aircraft. Syria, under the Ba'athist regime, has been sponsoring guerrilla raids into northern Israel from the Golan Heights for years, using Palestinian Fedayeen groups as proxies. These are not symbolic attacks. Israeli farmers in the Galilee are being shot at from the heights. Tractors are being targeted. Water infrastructure is being sabotaged. The Syrian military itself is dug into fortified positions along the Golan ridgeline, with pre-registered artillery aimed at Israeli settlements below. The terrain gives Syria an enormous natural advantage. The Golan rises over 1,000 feet above the Hula Valley, and any Israeli assault would have to climb exposed slopes under direct fire. Jordan's King Hussein is in a more complicated position. He is not an ideologue like the Syrian Baathists, and he has maintained quiet, back-channel contacts with Israeli officials for years. But he is under enormous political pressure from Nasser and from the large Palestinian population within his own kingdom. By late May 1967, he will sign a mutual defence pact with Egypt, placing his army under Egyptian command. The Arab Legion, Jordan's well-trained British-equipped army, will position itself along the entire length of the West Bank border, with artillery within range of Israeli airfields and the outskirts of Tel Aviv. So the picture, from the Israeli perspective, is this: a country 9 miles wide at its most vulnerable point, surrounded by armies that collectively field over 400,000 troops, more than 2,000 tanks, and over 600 combat aircraft. The combined Arab forces outnumber the Israel Defense Forces in every measurable category: manpower, armour, artillery, and aircraft. On paper, this is not a close contest. On paper, Israel should not survive a coordinated assault from all three directions, and in the spring of 1967, that coordinated assault appears to be exactly what is coming. The crisis escalates rapidly in May. On May 15th, Egyptian troops begin moving into the Sinai Peninsula in large numbers, 2 divisions, then 4, then 7. Nasser demands the withdrawal of the United Nations Emergency Force that has been stationed in the Sinai since the 1956 Suez Crisis, serving as a buffer between Egyptian and Israeli forces. The UN Secretary-General, U Thant, complies almost immediately, a decision that shocks the Israelis and removes the last physical barrier between the two armies. On May 22nd, Nasser announces the closure of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. This is the choke point at the southern tip of the Sinai, the narrow waterway connecting the Red Sea to the Israeli port of Eilat. Israel has previously declared that closure of the straits would be considered an act of war. Nasser knows this. He closes them anyway. The message to the Israeli public, and to the world, is unmistakable. Egypt is preparing for war. Syria is preparing for war. And now Jordan has joined the alliance. Radio Cairo broadcasts triumphant declarations. Nasser tells cheering crowds that the Arab armies will drive Israel into the sea. Ahmed Shukeri, the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, announces that there will be practically no Jewish survivors. This is the atmosphere in late May 1967, a combination of military mobilization, diplomatic isolation, and genocidal rhetoric that pushes the Israeli population into a state of genuine existential fear. Within Israel, the government of Prime Minister Levi Eshkol is under enormous pressure. Eshkol is a cautious, administrative leader, a builder of institutions, not a warrior, and his hesitation during the crisis is seen by many Israelis as weakness. The public demands action. The military demands authorization to strike. Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin and the senior command of the IDF believe that every day of delay works against Israel, because Israel's military depends on reservist mobilization, and every day those reservists are under arms is a day the economy hemorrhages. Israel cannot sustain a prolonged mobilization. It must either fight or stand down. On June 1st, under intense pressure, Eshkol brings Moshe Dayan into the cabinet as Minister of Defense. Dayan, the one-eyed general who led the Sinai campaign in 1956, is a national icon, and his appointment is meant to signal resolve. Behind the scenes, the decision to launch a preemptive strike has essentially already been made. The question is no longer whether to attack, but when and how. And it is in the how that the real story of the Six-Day War begins, because the Israeli plan that is about to unfold is not an improvisation. It is not a desperate gamble. It is the product of years of meticulous preparation, intelligence gathering, and doctrinal development. A war plan that has been rehearsed, refined, and updated continuously, waiting for exactly this moment. The plan is called Moked, Hebrew for focus, and it begins with the Air Force. Operation Moked is not a concept that was drawn up in the tense weeks of May 1967. Its origins stretch back nearly a decade to the late 1950s, when the Israeli Air Force began systematically studying the problem that defined Israel's entire strategic position. How does a small air force, outnumbered roughly 3-1, survive the opening hours of a war against enemies who can strike its airfields from multiple directions simultaneously? The answer that the IAF arrived at was simple in principle and enormously difficult in execution. You do not wait to absorb the first blow. You do not scramble interceptors and fight a defensive air battle over your own territory. You strike first, and you strike so hard and so precisely that the enemy air force ceases to exist before it can get off the ground. Every hour of air superiority you gain in the opening phase translates directly into freedom of action for your ground forces. And in a war where Israel must fight on 3 fronts with interior lines, air superiority is not a luxury. It is the precondition for survival. This is not a new idea in military thinking. The principle of destroying an enemy air force on the ground was demonstrated in the Second World War. The Luftwaffe did it to the Soviet Air Force in June 1941, and the Allies did it to the Luftwaffe in the months before D-Day. But what the Israeli Air Force developed in the years between 1958 and 1967 was something qualitatively different from those precedents. It was not a broad strategic bombing campaign. It was a surgical, tightly sequenced series of strikes designed to neutralize specific airfields in a specific order, with specific weapons, at specific times, using a force so small that every aircraft had to fly multiple sorties in a single day. And every sortie had to count. The architect of this plan was Brigadier General Ezra Weizmann, who commanded the IAF from 1958 to 1966, and his successor, Brigadier General Mordecai Hod, who refined and executed it. Weizmann understood that Israel's air force had one critical advantage that could offset its numerical inferiority: turnaround time. The time it takes to land a combat aircraft, refuel it, rearm it, and launch it again on another mission. In most air forces of that era, turnaround time for a fighter bomber was measured in hours. Weizmann drove his ground crews to reduce it to minutes. By 1967, Israeli ground crews could turn around a Mirage 3, land it, refuel it, rearm it with bombs, and have it back on the runway in under 8 minutes. Some crews achieved 7 minutes 50 seconds. This was unheard of in any air force in the world at that time. Here is why that matters. The Israeli Air Force had roughly 200 combat aircraft. The combined Arab air forces had over 600. In a one-sortie contest, Israel loses the numbers game decisively. But if each Israeli aircraft can fly 4 sorties in a single day, because turnaround time is 7 minutes instead of 2 hours, then 200 aircraft effectively become 800 sorties. The force multiplication is enormous, and it is entirely the product of ground crew training, logistics organization, and maintenance discipline. Not technology, not secret weapons, organizational preparation. Weizmann also understood that the strikes themselves had to be precise enough to close enemy runways, not merely damage buildings or scatter parked aircraft. A bombed hangar is an inconvenience. A cratered runway is a grounded air force. To solve this problem, the Israelis acquired and adapted a French-designed weapon, a runway penetration bomb that would hit the surface, burrow into the tarmac and sub-base, and then detonate, creating a deep crater that could not be quickly repaired. These bombs were paired with conventional munitions for destroying aircraft on the ground. Parked fighters and bombers would be strafed with cannon fire on follow-up passes after the runways were already cut. The targeting intelligence behind Mikad was equally precise. Israeli military intelligence, Amman, had spent years building a detailed picture of every Egyptian, Syrian and Jordanian airfield. Aerial reconnaissance, much of it flown by specially modified aircraft at high altitude, had photographed every base, every taxiway, every dispersal area, every anti-aircraft position. Intelligence analysts knew where specific aircraft types were parked, which runways were primary and which were secondary, where fuel and ammunition storage facilities were located, and what the daily routines of each base looked like. They knew, for example, that Egyptian air patrols typically flew at dawn, and that the aircraft from those patrols would be on the ground being refueled between 07:45 and 0800 local time. They knew that Egyptian senior officers typically arrived at their bases around 0800, and that there was a narrow window in the morning when the maximum number of aircraft would be on the ground, fueled, and vulnerable. Moked was timed to hit that window. The plan called for the first wave to launch at 7:14 Israeli time, 7:45 Egyptian time, and to arrive over Egyptian airfields simultaneously at 7:45 Israeli time. The flight profiles were calculated to keep the Israeli aircraft below Egyptian radar coverage for as long as possible. Rather than flying directly south across the Negev and into the Sinai, the obvious and expected route. The strike aircraft flew west over the Mediterranean, turned south along the sea, and then swept east into Egypt from an unexpected direction. Some formations flew as low as 50 feet above the water to avoid detection. Radio silence was absolute. The first wave targeted 11 Egyptian airfields simultaneously. The Mirages and Mystères came in low, dropped their runway penetration bombs on the main runways and taxiways, then pulled up and circled back to strafe the parked aircraft with their 30mm cannon. The effect was devastating. At airfield after airfield, the pattern repeated. Runways cratered in the first pass, aircraft destroyed on the ground in the second and third passes. Egyptian anti-aircraft crews caught off guard were slow to respond. Egyptian fighters that attempted to scramble found their runways blocked by craters and burning debris. Within the first 30 minutes, the Israeli Air Force destroyed over 100 Egyptian aircraft on the ground. But Moked was not a single blow. It was a rolling campaign. As the first wave returned to Israeli bases, the ground crews, those 7-minute turnaround ground crews, were already waiting. Aircraft landed, were refueled and rearmed, and launched again. The second wave hit additional Egyptian airfields, including bases deeper in the Nile Delta that had been spared in the first strike. Then a third wave, then a fourth. By noon on June 5th, roughly 6 hours after the first bombs fell, the Egyptian Air Force had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The numbers are staggering. Out of approximately 420 Egyptian aircraft, including those held in reserve and those undergoing maintenance, the Israelis destroyed 338 on the first day. 13 airfields were rendered inoperable. Egypt's bomber fleet, its MiG-21 interceptors, its ground attack aircraft, gone. Not defeated in aerial combat, not driven back. Destroyed on the ground before most of them ever took off, and the Israelis were not finished. Shortly after the strikes on Egypt began, Jordanian and Syrian forces entered the war, as expected. Jordanian artillery began shelling Israeli positions in Jerusalem and along the border. Jordanian Hawker Hunters, the small but capable British-built jets of the Royal Jordanian Air Force, launched strikes against Israeli airfields. Syrian aircraft hit targets in northern Israel. In the standard telling, this is the moment of maximum danger. Israel now fighting on 3 fronts simultaneously. But in operational reality, the IAF had planned for exactly this. Reserves of aircraft had been held back specifically to deal with Jordan and Syria once the Egyptian strikes were underway. By early afternoon on June 5th, the IAF turned its attention to the Jordanian and Syrian air forces. The Royal Jordanian Air Force was tiny, roughly 24 Hawker Hunters, and it was destroyed almost entirely within an hour. The Syrian Air Force, larger but caught in a similar state of unreadiness, lost 2/3 of its combat aircraft by the end of the day. An Iraqi airbase at H3 in western Iraq was also hit after Iraqi aircraft attempted a strike on Israel. By the evening of June 5th, the combined Arab air forces had lost over 400 aircraft. Israel had lost 26. The consequences of this were not merely numerical. Air superiority, total, unchallenged air superiority, transformed the ground war on every front. Israeli armoured columns advancing into the Sinai would move with close air support overhead and no threat from above. Egyptian troops retreating through the desert would be strafed and bombed without any air cover of their own. Jordanian positions in the West Bank would be hit from the air before Israeli ground forces even reached them. Syrian fortifications on the Golan Heights, which had withstood artillery bombardment, would be softened by precision airstrikes. Everything that followed in the next 5 days, the armoured blitz through the Sinai, the capture of Jerusalem, the storming of the Golan, all of it was made possible by what happened in those first 6 hours. Moked did not just win the air war. It set the conditions for victory on the ground before the ground war had properly begun. But the air campaign, decisive as it was, does not explain everything. Because air superiority alone does not take territory or defeat armies. It enables ground operations, but those ground operations still have to be planned, commanded, and executed. And on the ground, the 6-day war would test the Israeli military in ways that no amount of air cover could simplify. The most immediate and most dangerous ground front was the Sinai. By June 5th, Egypt had deployed 7 divisions into the Sinai Peninsula, approximately 100,000 troops and nearly 1,000 tanks. These forces were dug into 3 defensive lines stretching from the Gaza Strip in the north to the fortified positions around Abu Aghaila and Katef in the centre, and down to the passes at Mitla and Gidi in the southern Sinai. The Egyptian defensive plan was based on Soviet doctrine: deep-layered defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire, minefields, pre-registered artillery, and infantry dug into fortified trenches. The idea was to absorb an Israeli attack, bleed the advancing forces on the fortified positions, and then counterattack with armoured reserves held in the rear. On paper, it was a sound plan. The terrain favoured the defender. The Sinai is crossed by only a few passable routes for armoured vehicles, and the Egyptians had fortified the obvious choke points. An attacking force would have to advance through predictable corridors, under artillery fire, against prepared positions, and the Egyptians had more tanks in the Sinai than the Israelis would commit to the attack. The Israeli plan for the Sinai was built around 3 divisional-sized task forces, each assigned a different axis of advance. In the north, Brigadier General Israel Tal, one of the finest armoured commanders in Israeli history, would lead his division along the coastal road toward El Arish, smashing through the Egyptian defences at Rafah and Khan Yunis. In the centre, Brigadier General Ariel Sharon would assault the fortified complex at Abu Aghaila and Katef, the strongest Egyptian position in the Sinai. And in the south, Brigadier General Avraham Yoff would push his division through a gap between the northern and central axes, exploiting terrain that the Egyptians considered impassable for armour, to cut behind the Egyptian defensive lines and block retreat routes toward the Suez Canal. Each of these operations was a major tactical challenge, but the one that would demonstrate the Israeli way of war most clearly, the combination of detailed planning, combined arms coordination, and aggressive execution at the unit level, was Sharon's assault on Abu Aghaila. And it is there, in the sand and fortifications of a crossroads in the central Sinai, that the ground war would reveal its real character. Abu Aghaila was not just a position on a map, it was the key to the entire central Sinai. Whoever controlled the road junction at Abu Aghaila controlled the main east-west route through the peninsula, the axis that connected the Israeli border at Nitzana to the critical passes at Mitla and Gidi, and beyond them to the Suez Canal. The Egyptians understood this perfectly. They had lost Abu Aghaila in 1956, and they had spent the intervening 11 years turning the position into one of the most heavily fortified defensive complexes in the Middle East. The Abu Aghaila Katef defensive system stretched across roughly 10 miles of front. At its core were 3 parallel lines of infantry trenches, dug deep into the sand and reinforced with concrete and overhead cover. These trenches were manned by a full Egyptian infantry brigade, roughly 5,000 troops, supported by extensive minefields on the northern and southern approaches. Behind the infantry trenches, on higher ground to the west, the Egyptians had positioned 6 batteries of artillery, a mix of Soviet-supplied 122mm guns and 130mm heavy guns, with pre-registered fire covering every approach route. The artillery was dug in and sandbagged, with ammunition stockpiled for sustained bombardment. North of the main position, along a sand ridge, a battalion of tanks, Soviet T-34/85s, was dug into hull-down positions covering the northern flank, and behind everything, held in reserve at the road junction itself, was an additional armoured force that could be committed to counterattack any penetration. The position was designed according to Soviet defensive doctrine, and it was well designed. An attacker approaching from the east would first have to cross open ground under observed artillery fire, then penetrate the minefields, then assault the trench lines under direct fire from dug-in infantry, and if any attacking force broke through the trenches, it would still face the artillery batteries and the armoured reserve behind them. A conventional frontal assault against this kind of defence, even with superior numbers, would be extremely costly. And Ariel Sharon did not have superior numbers. His division was outnumbered by the defenders. Sharon had commanded a paratroop brigade in the 1956 Sinai campaign, and he had learned hard lessons about what happens when you attack fortified positions without adequate preparation. At the Mitla Pass in 1956, his paratroopers had walked into an ambush in a narrow defile and taken heavy casualties, an action that earned Sharon criticism from the high command and a reputation for recklessness. But Sharon was not merely reckless. He was a meticulous planner who combined aggressive intent with detailed tactical preparation. The plan he developed for Abu Aghaila was one of the most sophisticated combined arms operations of the 20th century, and it was designed to hit the Egyptian defences from every direction simultaneously, at night, in a way that would prevent the defenders from concentrating against any single threat. The attack was scheduled for the night of June 5th to 6th, after the Air Force had already achieved total air superiority. Sharon spent the daylight hours of June 5th moving his forces into position and conducting personal reconnaissance, driving forward in a half-track to observe the Egyptian positions from as close as he could get. His plan involved 6 separate elements, all coordinated to strike within a narrow time window. First, an infantry brigade would assault the Egyptian trench lines from the north, attacking on foot through the minefields under cover of darkness. Engineers would go ahead of the infantry to clear lanes through the mines. Second, a tank battalion would attack the dug-in Egyptian armour on the northern sand ridge, pinning and destroying the T-34s to prevent them from flanking the infantry assault. Third, Sharon's artillery, concentrated from across the division, would deliver a massive bombardment on the Egyptian gun positions behind the trenches, suppressing them during the critical minutes when the infantry was crossing the minefields. Fourth, and most unusually, a battalion of paratroopers would be helicoptered behind the Egyptian lines to land directly on top of the artillery positions, assaulting the gun crews from the rear while they were under bombardment. Fifth, a reconnaissance force would loop far to the south to block any Egyptian reinforcements moving up from the rear. And sixth, an armoured task force would be held ready to exploit any breakthrough, driving west through the position once the infantry had cracked the trench lines. 6 separate forces, moving on different axes, through darkness, in unfamiliar desert terrain, all needing to arrive and attack within minutes of each other. The coordination required was extraordinary. If the paratroopers landed too early, the Egyptian artillery would still be fully manned and would cut them to pieces. If the infantry assault went in before the artillery suppression began, the Egyptian guns would destroy them in the minefields. If the tank attack on the northern ridge failed, Egyptian armour would roll into the flank of the infantry. Every element depended on every other element, and there was almost no margin for timing errors. The attack went in after dark on June 5th. Sharon's artillery opened the bombardment at approximately 22:45 hours, over 100 guns firing simultaneously on the Egyptian artillery positions. The noise was tremendous. Shells walked across the Egyptian gun lines, throwing sand and debris into the air, forcing the gun crews into their shelters. Minutes later, the helicopters carrying the paratroop battalion came in low from the west. The paratroopers jumped into the darkness near the Egyptian artillery emplacements and immediately began assaulting the gun pits. The fighting was close and chaotic, paratroopers clearing gun positions with grenades and small arms, while Egyptian artillerymen, many of them disoriented by the bombardment, tried to organise a defence. Within an hour, the paratroopers had seized or disabled the majority of the Egyptian batteries. Simultaneously, the infantry brigade began its assault on the trench lines from the north. Engineers crawled forward through the darkness, probing for mines, marking lanes with tape and small lights. Behind them, the infantry companies advanced in single file through the cleared lanes, then fanned out as they reached the first trench line. The fighting in the trenches was intense, close quarters work, room by room, position by position, in near total darkness. Egyptian soldiers fought stubbornly in many positions, but with their artillery suppressed and then overrun, the defenders in the trenches were fighting without the fire support that their entire defensive plan depended on. On the northern ridge, Israeli tanks engaged the dug-in T-34s in a firefight that lasted through the early hours of the morning. The Israeli Centurion and Super Sherman tanks had superior optics and gunnery, and the T-34s, excellent weapons in their day, were a generation behind. One by one, the dug-in Egyptian tanks were knocked out. By the time the northern ridge was cleared, the flank of the infantry assault was secure. By dawn on June 6th, the Abu Agela Katef complex was in Israeli hands. The Egyptian defensive position, the strongest in the central Sinai, manned by a full brigade with armour and artillery support, had been broken in a single night. Egyptian casualties were heavy. Hundreds of defenders were killed, hundreds more captured, and large quantities of equipment were abandoned. Sharon's division had taken casualties of its own, but the position was open, and the road to the central Sinai passes lay ahead. The significance of Abu Agela went beyond the tactical. It demonstrated something fundamental about the Israeli approach to war in 1967, an approach that the Arab armies, for all their numerical superiority, could not match. The combined arms night assault that Sharon executed required a level of coordination, junior officer initiative, and inter-unit communication that the Egyptian military structure simply did not support. Egyptian units fought bravely in many cases, but they fought as isolated components of a rigid defensive plan. When the plan was disrupted, when the artillery was silenced, when the attack came from unexpected directions, when the situation on the ground stopped matching the pre-written orders, there was no mechanism for adaptation. Junior officers waited for instructions from senior commanders. Senior commanders waited for instructions from Cairo, and Cairo was receiving confused and often inaccurate reports from the front. This was not a failure of individual courage. It was a structural problem rooted in the nature of the Egyptian military system. The Egyptian armed forces in 1967 were organised around centralised command and political loyalty. Officers were promoted based on their connections to the regime as much as on their military competence. Initiative at the junior level was not encouraged. It was actively discouraged, because independent-minded officers were seen as potential political threats. The result was an army that could execute a pre-planned defence competently, but could not adapt when that plan was disrupted, and the Israeli method of war was specifically designed to disrupt plans. Meanwhile, on the northern axis, Israel Tal's division was fighting its way through the Egyptian defences at Rafah. This was a more straightforward armoured engagement, but no less intense. Tal's forces, spearheaded by a brigade of Centurion tanks under Colonel Shmuel Golan, punched through the Egyptian fortifications along the coastal road in a direct assault that relied on speed, firepower, and the willingness to accept risk. The Centurion, a British-designed tank that Israel had acquired and modified, was heavier and better armoured than the Soviet T-34s and T-54s it faced, and its 105mm gun was devastatingly accurate. Tal's tankers drove straight through the defensive positions, bypassing strongpoints where possible and overwhelming them with direct fire where necessary. The fighting at Rafah and Khan Yunis was bitter. Egyptian infantrymen with anti-tank weapons knocked out several Israeli tanks at close range. Minefields channeled the advance into kill zones, but with no air cover and no ability to call in air support of their own, the Egyptian defenders were fighting a one-dimensional battle against a combined arms force that controlled the sky above them. Israeli aircraft were overhead continuously, hitting any Egyptian concentration that attempted to form up for a counterattack. By the evening of June 5th, Tal's division had broken through the Rafah defences and was advancing toward El Arish, the largest Egyptian base in the northern Sinai. The road was littered with destroyed vehicles and abandoned equipment. Egyptian units were beginning to fall back, but the retreat was disorganised. No coordinated withdrawal orders had been issued, and many units simply disintegrated as their officers lost contact with higher command. And here, in the space between the collapse of the Egyptian forward defences and the retreat toward the canal, the 3rd Israeli Division, Avraham Yoff's, played its decisive role. Yoff's task had seemed nearly impossible on paper. He was ordered to drive his division through the sand dunes between the northern and central axes, terrain that the Egyptians had assessed as impassable for heavy vehicles, and emerge behind the Egyptian lines to cut off their retreat. Yoff's tanks and half-tracks ground through deep sand for hours, many vehicles becoming temporarily stuck and having to be towed free by others. The advance was slow and exhausting, but it was unopposed, precisely because the Egyptians had not defended terrain they believed could not be crossed. By the night of June 5th, Yoff's lead elements had reached the road junction at Bir Lafan, squarely behind the Egyptian forces that were now trying to retreat from El Arish and Abu Agela. When the retreating Egyptian columns ran into Yoff's blocking positions, the result was not a battle but a collapse. Egyptian vehicles piled up on the roads. Tanks tried to bypass the Israeli positions and became stuck in the sand. Units that had been retreating in some order dissolved into panic. Israeli aircraft, arriving at first light on June 6th, caught the traffic jams on the roads and turned them into killing grounds. The destruction of the Egyptian army in the Sinai was not accomplished solely by the initial breakthrough battles. It was accomplished by the combination of breakthrough and pursuit, the relentless exploitation of the initial success to prevent the Egyptians from establishing a new defensive line. And this too was not improvisation, it was doctrine. The Israeli armoured doctrine of 1967 emphasised exactly this kind of deep exploitation. Break through the crust, get into the rear, cut the lines of retreat, and turn an orderly withdrawal into a rout. The Air Force would handle anything that tried to reorganize. By June 7th, Israeli forces were approaching the Suez Canal. The Sinai campaign was, in operational terms, already decided, but two other fronts were now fully active, Jerusalem and the West Bank to the east, and the Golan Heights to the north, and each would present its own kind of challenge, its own kind of fighting, and its own lessons about the war that was unfolding with a speed that astonished the world. In Jerusalem, the battle was already underway, and it was nothing like the open desert warfare of the Sinai. It was close, urban, and deeply personal, a fight through ancient streets and stone buildings where every rooftop was a firing position and every alleyway could conceal a machine gun, and it was about to produce some of the most intense combat of the entire war. Jerusalem in June 1967 was a divided city. A concrete wall, barbed wire, and a strip of no man's land ran through its centre, separating Israeli West Jerusalem from Jordanian-held East Jerusalem. The division dated back to 1948, when the armistice lines of the First Arab-Israeli War had frozen the city in half. Jordan controlled the Old City, with its Western Wall, Temple Mount, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and Dome of the Rock, as well as the high ground to the north and east. Israel held the western neighbourhoods, the New City, and the governmental district. For 19 years, Israelis had been unable to visit the Western Wall. Jordanian snipers had occasionally fired across the line. The city existed in a state of tense, armed partition. Israel had not originally planned to fight in Jerusalem. The Israeli war plan prioritized the Sinai and the destruction of the Egyptian military. The assumption was that if Egypt was knocked out quickly, Jordan and Syria might choose not to fight, or at least limit their involvement. Prime Minister Eshkol sent a message to King Hussein through the UN on the morning of June 5th, essentially telling him, "Stay out of this war, and we will not attack you." If Hussein had accepted, the map of the Middle East today might look very different. But Hussein did not stay out. Whether driven by the terms of his mutual defence pact with Egypt, by political pressure from his own population, by misleading reports from Cairo claiming that Egypt was winning, or by some combination of all three, Jordan opened fire. At approximately 1100 hours on June 5th, Jordanian artillery began shelling West Jerusalem, Israeli airfields in the centre of the country, and the outskirts of Tel Aviv. Jordanian troops moved to seize the UN headquarters compound at Government House, on a hill overlooking the southern approach to the city. The Jordanian Arab Legion, small but professional, trained and formally officered by the British, began engaging Israeli positions along the entire length of the armistice line. The Israeli response was immediate but initially improvised. The units available in Jerusalem were not the country's best equipped formations. The Jerusalem Brigade was largely a reserve infantry brigade, and the paratroop brigade that would be thrown into the city, Colonel Mordecai Gur's 55th Paratroop Brigade, had originally been designated for a potential airborne drop in the Sinai. When the Sinai offensive succeeded so rapidly through ground assault, the paratroopers were redirected to Jerusalem by bus. They arrived in the city on the afternoon of June 5th, many of them still expecting to jump into the desert, and were immediately briefed for an urban assault they had not specifically trained for. The terrain in Jerusalem was unlike anything in the Sinai. The city is built on hills of pale limestone, and the old city is enclosed by massive Ottoman-era walls. The approaches from West Jerusalem to the old city passed through dense neighbourhoods of stone buildings. Jordanian positions in the police school, Ammunition Hill, the Sheikh Jarrah neighbourhood, and the fortified positions along the ridge north of the old city. The Jordanians had spent 19 years fortifying these positions. Trenches connected bunkers. Fields of fire had been cleared, minefields covered the approaches, and the Jordanian soldiers manning these positions were not conscripts. They were long-service regulars, many of them Bedouin, with a strong esprit de corps and real fighting experience. The Israeli command decided on a two-phase approach. First, the paratroopers would break through the Jordanian positions north of the old city, clearing the fortified ridge from Ammunition Hill through Sheikh Jarrah to the Augusta Victoria Hospital on the Mount of Olives. This would isolate the old city from reinforcement. Second, the paratroopers would enter the old city itself through one of its gates, with the objective of reaching the Western Wall and the Temple Mount. The first phase began after dark on June 5th, and it immediately became the most vicious close-quarters battle of the entire war. Ammunition Hill was the linchpin of the Jordanian defensive line north of the old city. It was a fortified compound, originally a British police training facility during the Mandate era, sitting on a hill that dominated the road between West Jerusalem and Mount Scopus. The Jordanians had turned it into a warren of interconnected trenches, bunkers, and firing positions. Concrete bunkers with overhead cover were connected by communication trenches 4 to 5 feet deep. Barbed wire ringed the perimeter. Minefields covered the approaches. A Jordanian infantry company, approximately 150 soldiers, held the position, and they had been told to hold it at all costs. The Israeli paratroopers who assaulted Ammunition Hill attacked from the north, breaching the perimeter wire with Bangalore torpedoes and pushing into the trench system. What followed was 4 hours of fighting at ranges measured in feet. The trenches were narrow and twisting. Visibility was almost zero in the darkness. Paratroopers moved through the communication trenches, throwing grenades around corners and firing at shadows. Jordanian soldiers fought back from bunker after bunker, refusing to withdraw. When grenades ran low, soldiers fought with bayonets, rifle butts, and entrenching tools. Officers were killed leading from the front. Squad leaders took over for fallen platoon commanders. Platoon sergeants took over for fallen squad leaders. The casualties on both sides were severe. Of the Israeli company that led the assault, nearly half were killed or wounded. The Jordanian garrison fought almost to the last man. Over 100 Jordanian soldiers were killed defending the position, and only a handful were taken prisoner. When the hill was finally cleared at dawn on June 6th, the paratroopers who had taken it were physically and emotionally shattered. The company commander who led the final assault later described it as the worst night of his life. The fighting at Ammunition Hill was not representative of the entire battle for Jerusalem, but it revealed something important about the Jordanian military that was true across the West Bank front. Jordanian soldiers, when properly positioned and led, fought with determination and skill. The Arab Legion was not the hollowed-out, politically distorted institution that parts of the Egyptian military had become. Its junior officers were competent, its soldiers were disciplined, and in fixed defensive positions they could exact a heavy price on any attacker. But the Jordanian military had 2 critical weaknesses that no amount of courage could overcome. The first was the absence of air cover. By the time the battle for Jerusalem was underway, the Royal Jordanian Air Force had already been destroyed on the ground. Jordanian positions across the West Bank were being hit by Israeli aircraft with no means of response. Troop movements, supply convoys, and reserve formations were all vulnerable to air attack. A Jordanian armoured brigade attempting to move from Jericho toward Jerusalem was caught by Israeli aircraft on the road and badly damaged before it could reach the battle. The second weakness was strategic. Jordan's defence of the West Bank depended on holding a long, narrow salient, a bulge of territory that jutted into Israel's midsection. This salient was vulnerable to being cut off at its base. If Israeli forces drove east from the coastal plain and reached the Jordan River, every Jordanian unit west of the river would be trapped. King Hussein and his commanders understood this risk, but they lacked the forces to defend the entire perimeter of the salient while simultaneously holding Jerusalem. Something had to give, and once the Air Force was gone, everything began to give at once. While the paratroopers fought through the northern approaches to the Old City, other Israeli forces were attacking across the West Bank on multiple axes. In the north, an Israeli brigade broke through Jordanian positions near Jenin and began advancing toward Nablus, the largest city in the northern West Bank. In the centre, forces pushed east from the Ben Gurion airport area toward Ramallah. In the south, a brigade moved toward Hebron. The objective was not simply to capture territory, but to cut the roads, block the retreat routes, and prevent the Jordanians from establishing a coherent defensive line anywhere west of the Jordan River. The Jordanian command structure held together longer than the Egyptian one had, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. By the evening of June 6th, Jordanian units across the West Bank were being ordered to withdraw east across the Jordan River. Some units executed orderly withdrawals, others, cut off by Israeli advances or hit by airstrikes during movement, broke apart. The roads leading down from the West Bank highlands toward the Jordan Valley, steep winding descents through barren terrain, became choke points where retreating columns were extremely vulnerable. In Jerusalem itself, the paratroopers spent the day of June 6th consolidating their positions along the ridge north of the Old City and preparing for the assault on the Old City itself. Mordecai Gur's brigade had taken significant casualties at Ammunition Hill and in the fighting through Sheikh Jarrah, but the northern approach was now clear. The Mount of Olives, the high ground east of the Old City, was in Israeli hands. From there the paratroopers could look down on the golden dome of the rock and the narrow streets of the ancient city below them. The question of whether to enter the Old City was not purely military. It was political, religious, and deeply emotional. The Old City contained the holiest sites in Judaism, and its capture would fulfill a longing that had defined Jewish identity for 2 millennia. But it also contained sites sacred to Christianity and Islam, and any fighting inside the walls risked damage to irreplaceable historical and religious structures. There was debate within the Israeli cabinet about whether to storm the Old City or simply besiege it and negotiate its surrender. Moshe Dayan, the defense minister, initially hesitated. He was concerned about the international reaction and the potential for a backlash if holy sites were damaged. But by the morning of June 7th, the military and political logic pointed in one direction. Jordanian resistance across the West Bank was collapsing. A ceasefire was likely within hours, and if Israel did not take the Old City before a ceasefire was imposed, it might never get another chance. Dayan authorized the assault. At 09:30 on June 7th, Ger's paratroopers entered the Old City through the Lion's Gate on its eastern wall. The advance was cautious. The paratroopers moved in half-tracks and on foot through the narrow streets, expecting resistance at every turn. But the Jordanian garrison in the Old City had largely withdrawn during the night, pulling back across the Jordan River with the rest of the retreating army. There was scattered sniper fire but no organised defence. The paratroopers pushed through the streets of the Muslim quarter, past the Via Dolorosa, and emerged onto the broad plaza of the Temple Mount. Ger radioed his headquarters with a message that became one of the most famous transmissions in Israeli military history. "The Temple Mount is in our hands," he reported. Minutes later, the paratroopers descended to the western wall, the last remnant of the ancient Jewish temple, a wall of massive limestone blocks that had stood for 2,000 years. Soldiers who had been fighting house to house in the darkness 36 hours earlier stood before the wall in silence, many of them weeping. The brigade's chaplain, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, blew a shofar. Soldiers pressed their faces against the ancient stones. It was a moment of profound emotional power, and it would become the defining image of the Six-Day War in Israeli memory. But even as the paratroopers stood at the western wall, the war was not over. In the Sinai, Israeli forces were still pursuing the remnants of the Egyptian army toward the Suez Canal. Across the West Bank, mopping up operations continued, and to the north, the most formidable natural obstacle of the entire war still had to be dealt with. The Golan Heights remained in Syrian hands. Syrian artillery was still firing on Israeli settlements in the Galilee, and the fortifications on the Golan, bunkers blasted into volcanic basalt, minefields stretching across every approach route, dug-in tanks and anti-tank positions covering every avenue of advance, were the most formidable defensive positions that any Israeli force would face in the entire conflict. The battle for the Golan would be the last act of the Six-Day War, and it would be the hardest fight of all. The Golan Heights is a plateau of volcanic basalt that rises abruptly from the flat agricultural land of the upper Jordan Valley and the Galilee. The escarpment on its western face, the face that looks down on Israel, climbs between 1,200 and 1,700 feet in a series of steep rocky slopes cut by deep ravines. The terrain is not sand like the Sinai, it is black volcanic rock, hard and jagged, strewn with boulders the size of cars. The soil is thin where it exists at all. In many places the ground cannot be dug into without explosives. Roads are few, narrow and easily blocked. For an attacking force trying to climb from the valley floor to the plateau above, the Golan presents a nearly vertical battlefield where every advantage belongs to the defender. Syria had held this ground since 1948, and for 19 years it had been turning the western escarpment into a fortress. The fortifications were not improvised field positions. They were engineered defensive works, bunkers constructed from reinforced concrete and volcanic basalt, sunk into the ridgeline with walls thick enough to withstand direct hits from artillery and even aerial bombs. Trenches connected the bunkers, many of them cut into solid rock and roofed with steel beams and earth. Anti-tank ditches had been bulldozed across the approach routes. Minefields covered every slope, every saddle, every path that a vehicle might use to climb the escarpment. The Syrians had dug these positions over years, not weeks, and they had been designed with Soviet engineering assistance. Manning these fortifications were approximately 40,000 Syrian troops, infantry, armour and artillery, organised into several brigades with substantial reserves held on the plateau behind the forward positions. The Syrians had over 260 tanks, many of them dug into hull-down positions with only their turrets exposed above the basalt. They had hundreds of artillery pieces registered on every approach route, every road junction, every piece of open ground on the slopes below, and they had the supreme advantage of elevation. From the top of the escarpment, Syrian observers could see every movement in the Israeli settlements below. Every vehicle, every troop concentration, every column forming up for an attack would be visible for miles. For the Israeli communities in the Galilee, the Golan was not an abstract strategic problem. It was a daily reality of fear. Syrian artillery had been shelling the settlements intermittently for years. Kibbutzim in the Hula Valley had built underground shelters where children ate their meals and attended school. Farmers worked their fields knowing that a Syrian observer on the heights might call in a fire mission at any time. Tractors had been hit. Houses had been hit. People had been killed. The situation was intolerable, and the Israeli military had long wanted to take the Golan. But the terrain was so formidable, and the fortifications so dense that every operational plan carried the risk of catastrophic casualties. During the first 4 days of the Six-Day War, the Golan had been a secondary front. Israel's strategic priority was Egypt, then Jordan. Syrian artillery continued to shell the Galilee throughout the week, and there were minor ground engagements along the border, but the main Israeli effort was directed elsewhere. The Syrian command, watching the rapid collapse of Egypt and Jordan, was in an increasingly uncomfortable position. Damascus had been the loudest voice calling for war, the most aggressive sponsor of guerrilla attacks against Israel, the regime most publicly committed to Israel's destruction. And now, with Egypt's army destroyed and Jordan's army in retreat, Syria had done almost nothing except shell some farming villages. Within the Israeli government and military, the debate over whether to attack the Golan was intense and ran right up to the last hours. Defense Minister Dayan was initially opposed. He considered the fortifications too strong, the terrain too difficult, and the potential casualties too high. The Northern Command, under Brigadier General David Elazar, argued forcefully that the attack was both necessary and feasible. Necessary because a ceasefire was imminent, and this was the only opportunity to end the Syrian artillery threat permanently, and feasible because total Israeli air superiority could compensate for the terrain disadvantages. Chief of Staff Rabin supported Elazar. Dayan resisted until June 9th, the 5th day of the war. What changed Dayan's mind was a combination of factors. The speed of the victories in the Sinai and the West Bank had freed up air and ground assets. Intelligence indicated that Syrian morale was shaken by the destruction of the Egyptian and Jordanian armies, and the diplomatic clock was running out. The United Nations Security Council was moving toward imposing a ceasefire, and once that ceasefire took effect, any future attempt to take the Golan would lack international justification. On the morning of June 9th, Dayan authorized the attack. Elazar's plan called for a direct assault up the western escarpment, concentrated on the northern sector of the Golan where the terrain, while still extremely difficult, offered a few narrow routes that armoured vehicles could potentially climb. The main effort would be directed at 2 axes. The first ran from the settlement of Kfar Zold up a narrow road toward the Syrian position at Kala on the northern shoulder of the plateau. The second targeted the fortified position at Tel Azaziat, a strong point on a prominent hill that dominated the approaches from the Dan area. Additional attacks would be launched further south to fix the Syrian forces in place and prevent them from reinforcing the northern sector. The assault began at 11:30 hours on June 9th, preceded by intensive airstrikes. Israeli aircraft hit the Syrian bunkers and artillery positions with bombs and napalm, flying sortie after sortie against the fortifications. The airstrikes were effective against exposed positions, troop concentrations and artillery emplacements, but the deep concrete bunkers on the ridgeline were largely impervious. Aircraft could suppress the defenders temporarily, but they could not destroy the fortifications themselves. The infantry and armour would have to do that the hard way. The lead units in the northern assault were bulldozer tanks, Centurions and Super Shermans fitted with dozer blades, that had to physically clear paths through the minefields while under direct fire from the Syrian positions above. Behind them came regular tanks and infantry in half-tracks. The advance was agonizingly slow. The roads were narrow, often single-track, with steep drops on one side and rock walls on the other. A single knocked-out vehicle could block the entire column. Syrian anti-tank guns and dug-in tanks fired down on the advancing Israelis from positions that were extremely difficult to suppress. Artillery rained down on the approach routes. The fighting at the individual strongpoints was some of the most brutal of the war. At Tel Azaziat, Israeli infantry assaulted a complex of bunkers and trenches that had been built into the volcanic rock over many years. The attackers had to climb steep slopes under machine gun fire, clear minefields by hand, and then fight their way into bunker after bunker. Syrian soldiers resisted fiercely in many positions. The bunkers were so solidly constructed that grenades thrown through firing slits sometimes failed to incapacitate the defenders inside. Soldiers had to enter the bunkers and clear them at close range, in the dark, against defenders who knew the layout of every room and corridor. At Kala, the story was similar. The Syrian position commanded the road from below, and every vehicle that attempted to climb was exposed to fire from multiple directions. Israeli tank commanders fought with their hatches open, necessary for visibility on the narrow, twisting road, and several were killed by machine gun fire and shell fragments. The column stalled repeatedly as lead vehicles were hit and had to be pushed off the road to allow those behind to continue. Bulldozer tanks scraped paths through rubble and mine craters while Syrian shells burst around them. Progress was measured in hundreds of meters per hour. But two factors were working relentlessly in Israel's favour, and both of them were products of the same structural advantages that had defined the entire war. The first was air superiority. Israeli aircraft were overhead continuously, hitting any Syrian reinforcement column that tried to move forward, any artillery battery that revealed its position by firing, any concentration of vehicles or troops behind the front line. The Syrian reserves, armoured units and infantry brigades held on the plateau behind the forward fortifications, could not move to reinforce the embattled forward positions without being attacked from the air. This meant that the Syrian defenders on the escarpment were fighting in isolation. Each strongpoint was on its own. When one fell, there was no counterattack to retake it. The second factor was the collapse of command cohesion at the upper levels of the Syrian military. By the afternoon of June 9th, as Israeli forces began cracking the first line of fortifications, something remarkable happened. Damascus radio broadcast a communique announcing that the city of Quneitra, the provincial capital of the Golan and the Syrian military headquarters on the plateau, had fallen to the Israelis. This was false. Quneitra had not fallen. Israeli forces were still fighting on the escarpment, miles away from the city. The premature announcement appears to have been a combination of panic, miscommunication, and possibly a deliberate attempt by certain factions within the Syrian military or government to trigger a ceasefire before the situation deteriorated further. The effect of the broadcast was catastrophic for the Syrian defence. Units on the plateau that were still in their positions, still capable of fighting, heard on their radios that their headquarters had been captured. Officers who had been preparing to hold their positions or mount counterattacks concluded that the battle was lost. Some units began withdrawing toward Damascus without orders, others abandoned their positions and fell back in disorder. The carefully constructed defensive system, which had been designed to force the Israelis to fight through layer after layer of fortifications at enormous cost, began to unravel not because every position had been overrun, but because the command structure that held the system together lost confidence in itself. Israeli forces on the escarpment noticed the change almost immediately. Positions that had been fiercely defended hours earlier were found abandoned. Bunkers that should have required costly assaults were empty, with weapons, ammunition, and personal equipment left behind. The pace of advance accelerated dramatically. By the evening of June 9th, Israeli units were up on the plateau and moving east toward Quneitra. By the morning of June 10th, the city itself was reached, and found largely abandoned, its Syrian garrison having withdrawn during the night. The contrast with the Egyptian collapse in the Sinai was instructive. In the Sinai, the Egyptian command structure had broken down under the shock of losing its air force and the speed of the Israeli armoured advance. In the Golan, the Syrian fortifications were stronger, the terrain was far more favourable to the defence, and the forward troops had fought with genuine determination. But the command structure failed in a different way, through a premature announcement that turned an orderly defence into an unnecessary retreat. In both cases, the pattern was the same. Arab armies that were capable of fighting effectively at the tactical level were undermined by systemic failures at the operational and strategic level, failures of communication, coordination, and command authority that turned local setbacks into general collapse. By 1830 hours on June 10, 1967, a United Nations ceasefire took effect. The Six-Day War was over. In less than 6 full days of fighting, Israel had conquered the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank including East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. The territorial gains were enormous. Israel now controlled an area roughly 3.5 times the size of its pre-war territory. 3 Arab armies had been defeated. The combined Arab air forces had been destroyed. Over 15,000 Arab soldiers were dead and thousands more were captured. Israel had lost approximately 700 killed and over 2,500 wounded. Painful losses for a small country, but a fraction of the casualties that had been feared. The military victory was total, but the war's consequences would prove to be far more complicated than the victory itself, and understanding those consequences requires stepping back from the battlefields and examining what, exactly, had made this outcome possible, and what it meant for the future. Because the Six-Day War was not simply a triumph of Israeli arms, it was a demonstration of a specific kind of military effectiveness, rooted in specific organizational and doctrinal choices, operating against opponents whose specific structural weaknesses made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of warfare Israel practiced. And those structural factors, on both sides, deserve close examination. To understand why the Six-Day War ended the way it did, you have to resist the temptation to explain it through individual brilliance or national character. The Israeli military in 1967 was not staffed by supermen. The Arab armies were not staffed by cowards. The outcome was determined by institutional differences in how each side organized its forces, trained its officers, processed information, and made decisions under pressure. These differences were not accidental. They were the product of political systems, military cultures, and decades of choices that shaped each army into a specific kind of instrument, effective at certain things and brittle at others. Start with the Israeli side. The Israel Defense Forces in 1967 was a conscript army with a small professional corps, built around a reserve mobilization system. In peacetime, the standing army was relatively small, perhaps 60 to 70,000 personnel. But upon mobilization, the IDF could expand to over 250,000 within 48 to 72 hours, as reservists reported to their units, drew equipment from pre-positioned stockpiles, and moved to their assigned assembly areas. This system was not merely a manpower arrangement, it was the foundation of the entire Israeli way of war. Because the reserves included men who had served together for years, trained together annually, and knew each other personally, reserve units could reach combat readiness with extraordinary speed. A tank brigade that existed on Monday as a collection of civilian mechanics, teachers, and shopkeepers could be a functioning armoured formation by Wednesday. The mobilization system also meant that Israel could not sustain a prolonged war. Every day the reserves were under arms was a day the economy lost a significant percentage of its workforce. This constraint was not a weakness to be lamented. It was a structural reality that shaped doctrine. The IDF was designed to fight short, decisive wars. It had to win quickly, or face economic and demographic exhaustion. This meant that Israeli doctrine emphasized offensive action, rapid maneuver, and the exploitation of breakthroughs. Commanders were trained to push forward, accept risk, and maintain momentum even when flanks were exposed or casualties were mounting. Waiting for perfect conditions was a luxury Israel could not afford. This offensive doctrine extended down to the lowest levels of command. Israeli junior officers, platoon and company commanders, were trained to exercise initiative within the framework of the overall plan. If the plan called for taking a position and the approach route was blocked, a company commander was expected to find another way without waiting for new orders from above. If contact with higher headquarters was lost, junior leaders were expected to continue the mission based on their understanding of the commander's intent. This culture of initiative, and what military theorists call mission-type tactics or Auftrags tactic, borrowing the German term, was not just a theoretical preference. It was drilled into officers through training exercises, reinforced through promotion patterns, and demonstrated in practice by senior commanders who led from the front. The Israeli officer corps in 1967 was conspicuously forward. Commanders at every level, from company to division, were expected to be at or near the point of decision. Brigade commanders rode with their lead battalions. Division commanders flew over the battlefield in light aircraft or moved in command half-tracks close behind the forward units. This had costs. Israeli officer casualties were proportionally very high, and losing a key commander at a critical moment could disrupt an operation. But the benefits outweighed the costs. Forward commanders could see the ground, read the situation, and make decisions in minutes rather than hours. They could exploit opportunities as they appeared and redirect forces without waiting for information to travel up and down a communication chain. Now compare this with the Egyptian and Syrian systems. Both armies were organised along Soviet lines, with centralised command structures that concentrated decision-making authority at the top. This was not simply a military choice, it was a political necessity. In both Egypt and Syria, the military was intimately connected to the regime. Officers held their positions in part because of political loyalty. The intelligence services monitored the officer corps for signs of independent thinking or potential disloyalty. Promoting officers who showed too much initiative was politically dangerous, because an officer who could think independently on the battlefield might also think independently about politics. The coups and counter-coups that had characterized Arab politics since the 1940s had made every regime acutely sensitive to the threat posed by ambitious military officers. The result was a command culture that discouraged initiative and rewarded obedience. Orders flowed from the top. Junior officers executed those orders as received, regardless of whether the situation on the ground had changed. When the situation did change, when an Israeli attack came from an unexpected direction, when a position was outflanked, when a counterattack needed to be organised on short notice, the system seized up. Junior officers radioed their superiors for instructions. Superiors radioed their superiors. By the time a decision was made and communicated back down the chain, the tactical moment had passed. This was not a minor organisational quirk. It was a fundamental structural weakness that manifested across every front of the Six-Day War. At Abu Aghaila, the Egyptian garrison fought bravely in its fortified positions, but could not adapt when Sharon's forces attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The defenders had a plan for a frontal assault. They did not have a plan for paratroopers landing on their artillery from behind while infantry attacked their trenches from the north and tanks hit their armour from the flank. Each element of the defence fought in isolation because no junior commander had the authority or the training to coordinate a response to an unexpected situation. In the Sinai retreat, the consequences were even more severe. When Egyptian forward positions began to collapse on June 5th and 6th, there was no orderly withdrawal plan in place. The centralised command structure meant that withdrawal orders had to come from Cairo, from Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amer, the Egyptian commander-in-chief, who was increasingly out of touch with the reality on the ground. When Amer finally ordered a general withdrawal on the evening of June 6th, the order was issued in near panic, without staging lines, without rearguard designations, without traffic control plans for the limited number of roads through the Sinai. The result was chaos. Entire divisions tried to funnel through the same narrow passes simultaneously. Vehicle columns backed up for miles. Israeli aircraft caught these traffic jams in the open desert and destroyed them systematically. Thousands of Egyptian soldiers who might have been evacuated in an orderly retreat were killed, captured, or left to walk across the desert on foot. Hundreds of tanks, armoured vehicles and artillery pieces that might have been saved were abandoned on the roads or destroyed in place. The Egyptian army did not simply lose the Sinai, it disintegrated in the Sinai, and the disintegration was as much a product of command failure as of Israeli tactical superiority. The intelligence dimension of the war reinforced these asymmetries. Israeli military intelligence, Ammon, had built an extraordinarily detailed picture of the Arab military forces over many years. The intelligence collection was not limited to satellite imagery or signals intercepts, though both played a role. Israeli intelligence officers cultivated human sources, debriefed defectors, analysed open-source publications from Arab military journals, and studied Soviet doctrine to predict how Arab armies trained on that doctrine would behave. The result was an operational picture of remarkable depth. Israeli commanders knew the Egyptian order of battle, which divisions were where, what equipment they had, who commanded them, and what their standard operating procedures were. They knew the locations and layouts of every Arab airfield, as we saw with Operation Moked. They knew the fortification plans at Abu Agela and on the Golan Heights. Arab intelligence capabilities, by contrast, were fragmented and politicized. Egyptian military intelligence was divided between several competing agencies, each loyal to a different power center within the regime. Intelligence assessments were shaped by what superiors wanted to hear rather than by what the evidence showed. When Israeli forces were observed mobilizing in late May, Egyptian intelligence assessments consistently overestimated Egyptian capabilities and underestimated Israeli readiness. Reports that reached Nasser and Amer were filtered through layers of subordinates who understood that delivering bad news was a career-ending proposition, and possibly a life-ending one. The information environment in which Arab commanders operated was further degraded by a phenomenon that had no equivalent on the Israeli side: the gap between public rhetoric and military reality. For weeks before the war, Arab state media had been broadcasting triumphant predictions of victory. Cairo radio declared daily that the Arab armies would sweep Israel into the sea. This rhetoric served a domestic political purpose, but it created an information environment in which realistic military assessments were drowned out by propaganda. When the war actually began and the results were catastrophic, the same media apparatus initially reported Arab victories. On the morning of June 5th, as the Egyptian Air Force was being destroyed on the ground, Cairo radio announced that Egyptian forces were advancing into Israel and that Israeli aircraft were being shot down in large numbers. These false reports were heard not only by Arab civilians, but by Arab military commanders and political leaders, including King Hussein, who may have entered the war in part because he believed Egypt was winning. The result was a cascading information failure. Decisions were made based on false reports, resources were committed based on imaginary successes, and when the reality became impossible to deny, the psychological shock was so severe that it produced the kind of sudden organizational collapse that was visible in the Syrian false broadcast about Quneitra. There is one more structural factor that deserves attention, and it is perhaps the most fundamental of all: the question of combined arms integration. Modern warfare, since at least the Second World War, has been defined by the ability to coordinate different types of military force: infantry, armour, artillery, air power, engineers, logistics, into a coherent operation where each element supports the others. This is not merely a matter of having all these components available. Every army in the Six-Day War had infantry, tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The question is whether these components can be made to work together in real time, under the pressure of contact with the enemy, in conditions that are never exactly as planned. The Israeli military in 1967 was exceptionally good at combined arms integration, and the reason was the same structural factor that enabled everything else: a command culture that delegated authority downward and emphasized direct communication between units at the forward edge. When an Israeli tank battalion encountered a fortified position, it could call for artillery support, coordinate with infantry, and request airstrikes through a communication system that connected the forward elements directly to the supporting arms. The Israeli Air Force had liaison officers with the ground divisions. Artillery forward observers moved with the lead companies. Engineers were integrated into the assault columns. The Arab armies had the same components, but could not integrate them effectively under combat conditions. Egyptian artillery at Abu Agila was pre-registered on fixed targets, and could deliver effective fire as long as the battle followed the expected script. But when the script was disrupted, the artillery could not shift to new targets quickly, because the authorization to change fire plans had to come from higher headquarters. Syrian tanks on the Golan were dug into excellent positions, but they could not coordinate with infantry or artillery in a fluid defense, because the communication links between different arms ran vertically, up to higher command and back down, rather than horizontally between cooperating units. These structural differences in command culture, intelligence, information flow, and combined arms coordination explain the outcome of the Six-Day War more completely than any account of individual heroism or national spirit. Israel won because its military system was designed for the kind of war it fought: short, fast, offensive, and dependent on initiative at every level. The Arab armies lost because their military systems were designed for political control rather than operational effectiveness, and when those systems were subjected to the shock and confusion of actual combat, they could not adapt. But recognizing this does not make the victory cost-free, and it does not mean the war's consequences were as clean as its execution, because the territory Israel conquered in 6 days would create political, demographic, and strategic problems that remain unresolved more than half a century later. And the lessons the war seemed to teach about the supremacy of preemptive attack, about the reliability of rapid military solutions to strategic problems, would be tested again just 6 years later in a very different war that nearly reversed the outcome entirely. The ceasefire on June 10, 1967, left Israel in possession of territory that transformed its strategic position overnight. The Sinai Peninsula, over 23,000 square miles of desert, now served as a vast buffer between the Egyptian heartland and Israel's southern border. The Golan Heights, those volcanic ridges that had allowed Syrian artillery to terrorize the Galilee for 19 years, were now under Israeli control, and the Syrian guns were silent. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Old City, was in Israeli hands, and with it the Jordan River line, a natural defensive barrier far more formidable than the old armistice lines that had left Israel 9 miles wide at its narrowest point. From a purely military geography standpoint, Israel's position after the war was incomparably stronger than before it. The country now had strategic depth it had never possessed. An Egyptian attack would have to cross the entire Sinai before reaching Israeli population centres. A Syrian assault would have to climb the Golan Escarpment from the east, a far more difficult proposition than defending it from prepared positions on top. The Jordan River Valley provided a natural moat along the entire eastern frontier. For a country that had spent its entire existence fearing a coordinated attack that could cut it in half in an hour, this territorial expansion was not an abstraction. It was the difference between existential vulnerability and defensible borders. But the war also planted problems that would grow more dangerous with every passing year. The most immediate was the question of what to do with the people who lived in the conquered territories. The West Bank was home to over 600,000 Palestinian Arabs. The Gaza Strip held another 350,000. East Jerusalem had a substantial Arab population. These people were now living under Israeli military occupation, and their political status was undefined. They were not Israeli citizens. They were not citizens of any recognized state. They were a population under military administration, governed by the army of a country that had not yet decided whether it intended to keep the territory, trade it for peace, or settle it with its own population. In the weeks after the war, there was genuine debate within the Israeli government about the future of the conquered lands. Some leaders, including figures in the Labour Party establishment, viewed the territories primarily as bargaining chips, assets to be exchanged in future peace negotiations for recognised borders and diplomatic normalisation. The formula that emerged from this thinking was encapsulated in United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, adopted in November 1967, which called for Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied in the recent conflict in exchange for the termination of all claims of belligerency and the right of every state in the area to live in peace within secure and recognised boundaries. The resolution was deliberately ambiguous. It said withdrawal from territories, not from all the territories, and both sides would spend decades arguing over what it meant. Other voices within Israel saw the conquered territories in very different terms. For religious nationalists, the West Bank was not the West Bank at all. It was Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland of the Jewish people, and its capture was not a military accident but a divine fulfillment. The Western Wall, now accessible for the first time in 19 years, became the most powerful symbol of this interpretation. Within months of the war's end, the first Israeli settlements began appearing in the occupied territories, initially small, often established by religious groups, without explicit government authorization, but tolerated and eventually supported by successive governments of both left and right. The settlement project would become one of the most consequential and contentious outcomes of the Six-Day War. Each new settlement created facts on the ground that made future territorial compromise more difficult. Each settlement required military protection, which deepened the occupation, and the occupation itself, the daily reality of military checkpoints, administrative detention, land confiscation, and the denial of political rights to a large civilian population, created grievances that would fuel decades of resistance, uprising, and violence. But in June 1967, these consequences were still in the future. The immediate aftermath of the war was dominated by a very different set of reactions. In Israel, the mood was euphoric. The existential dread of late May, when many Israelis had genuinely feared a second Holocaust, had been replaced in 6 days by an overwhelming military victory. The speed and completeness of the triumph reinforced a narrative of Israeli invincibility that would shape the country's strategic thinking for years. The IDF became the most trusted institution in Israeli society. Moshe Dayan, with his eye patch and confident swagger, became an international celebrity. The paratroopers at the Western Wall became national icons. There was a widespread feeling that the Arab threat had been permanently broken, that the military balance had shifted so decisively that no Arab coalition would dare challenge Israel again. This confidence was understandable but dangerous. It led to a set of assumptions that would prove catastrophic just 6 years later. The assumption that Arab armies were fundamentally incapable of effective military action. The assumption that Israeli intelligence would always provide adequate warning of an attack. The assumption that air superiority could be achieved as quickly and completely in any future war as it had been in 1967. The assumption that the territorial buffer provided by the Sinai and the Golan made Israel essentially invulnerable to surprise. Every one of these assumptions would be shattered on October 6, 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack that caught Israel almost completely off guard. In the Arab world, the defeat of June 1967 was experienced as a profound humiliation, a trauma that reshaped politics, culture, and identity across the region. The Arabic word that came to define the war was al-Naqsa, the setback, though in reality it was far more than a setback. It was the collapse of a political vision. Nasser's pan-Arab nationalism, which had promised that Arab unity and revolutionary will could overcome any obstacle, had been tested against military reality and found hollow. The armies that were supposed to liberate Palestine had been destroyed in less than a week. The air forces that were supposed to defend Arab skies had been wiped out on the ground before breakfast. Nasser offered his resignation on June 9th in a televised address that produced massive popular demonstrations demanding he stay. He withdrew the resignation and remained in power, but he was a diminished figure. The confident, charismatic leader who had defied the Western powers at Suez and inspired a generation of Arab nationalists was now the man who had led his country into a catastrophic defeat. He would spend his remaining years, he died in September 1970, trying to rebuild the Egyptian military with renewed Soviet assistance, but the aura of inevitability that had surrounded him was gone. The defeat also accelerated a shift in Palestinian political consciousness that had been building since the 1950s. Before 1967, the Palestinian cause had been largely subsumed within the broader pan-Arab movement. The liberation of Palestine was supposed to be achieved by Arab states acting on behalf of the Palestinian people. After 1967, with the Arab states discredited, Palestinian organizations increasingly asserted their own agency. The Palestine Liberation Organization, under Yasser Arafat's leadership, moved toward a strategy of guerrilla warfare and political mobilization that did not depend on the conventional military power of Arab governments. The Battle of Karameh in March 1968, a Jordanian-Palestinian engagement with Israeli forces along the Jordan River, became a rallying point for this new direction, even though the battle's military results were ambiguous at best. The Soviet Union, which had supplied and trained the defeated Arab armies, faced its own reckoning. The speed with which Soviet-equipped forces had been destroyed by Western-equipped Israeli forces was deeply embarrassing and raised uncomfortable questions about the quality of Soviet weapons systems and military doctrine. Moscow responded by dramatically increasing its military commitment to the region, pouring new equipment into Egypt and Syria, sending thousands of military advisors, and eventually deploying Soviet combat personnel to Egypt during the War of Attrition that followed along the Suez Canal between 1967 and 1970. The Middle East became one of the primary theatres of Cold War competition, with the superpowers arming and advising their respective clients in a cycle that made each subsequent conflict more dangerous. The international diplomatic landscape was equally transformed. Before the war, the Arab-Israeli conflict had been one of many regional disputes competing for global attention. After the war, it became the central issue of Middle Eastern politics and one of the defining problems of international diplomacy. Resolution 242 established a framework for negotiations that would persist for decades, but the resolution itself was a framework, not a solution. It outlined principles: land for peace, secure borders, the inadmissibility of territorial acquisition by force, without specifying how those principles should be applied. Each side read the resolution to support its own position, and the fundamental questions, the borders, the status of Jerusalem, the fate of the Palestinian refugees, the future of the settlements, remained unresolved. The United States, which had maintained a relatively balanced position in the region before 1967, began tilting decisively toward Israel in the war's aftermath. The speed and completeness of Israel's victory, achieved with French and British rather than American equipment, demonstrated that Israel was the dominant military power in the region and a potentially valuable strategic partner. Over the following years, the United States would replace France as Israel's primary arms supplier, beginning a military and diplomatic relationship that would become one of the defining features of American foreign policy in the Middle East. For the military professionals, the officers and strategists and defense planners on all sides who studied the war and its aftermath, the Six-Day War offered a set of tactical and operational lessons that seemed clear at the time, but would prove more complicated than they appeared. The apparent lesson of Moat was that preemptive airstrikes could decide a war before it began. The apparent lesson of the Sinai campaign was that fast-moving armoured forces with air superiority could annihilate a larger defending force. The apparent lesson of the Golan was that even the most formidable fortifications could be overcome by determined assault backed by total air supremacy. These lessons were not wrong exactly, but they were incomplete. They described what had happened in a specific war, under specific conditions, against opponents with specific weaknesses. They did not describe universal principles of warfare, and the failure to recognize this distinction, the tendency to treat the Six-Day War as a template rather than a case study, would have consequences that became brutally apparent in October 1973, because the Egyptian and Syrian militaries that were shattered in 1967 did not simply accept defeat and stagnate. They studied their failures with painful honesty. They identified the structural weaknesses that had led to their collapse, and they began, methodically and deliberately, to rebuild their forces with specific countermeasures designed to neutralize the Israeli advantages that had been so decisive in June 1967. The next war would be fought on very different terms. The rebuilding effort that Egypt and Syria undertook after 1967 was not a simple matter of replacing destroyed equipment. Soviet warehouses could resupply tanks and aircraft. What could not be replaced so easily was the institutional confidence that had been shattered in 6 days. The Egyptian military that emerged from the war was an organization in crisis, not just materially but psychologically. Officers who had commanded divisions in the Sinai had watched those divisions dissolve. Pilots who had trained for years never got their aircraft off the ground. Staff officers who had written elaborate defensive plans saw those plans rendered irrelevant in hours. The gap between what the Egyptian military had believed about itself and what the war had revealed was enormous, and closing that gap required more than new equipment. It required an honest accounting of what had gone wrong. That accounting began almost immediately, and it was driven by a figure who would become the central architect of Egypt's military recovery, General Abdel Moneim Riyad, the Egyptian Chief of Staff, and after his death in 1969, by his successor, General Saad el-Shazli, and ultimately by the man who would plan and command the 1973 war, General Mohammed Abdel Ghani el-Ghamasi, under the political direction of Anwar Sadat, who succeeded Nasser after his death in 1970. But the analytical work that underpinned the recovery was a collective effort, involving hundreds of Egyptian officers who were tasked with studying every engagement of the Six-Day War and identifying the specific failures that had produced the defeat. Their conclusions were uncomfortable but clear. The Egyptian military had not been defeated because its soldiers lacked courage. The fighting at Abu Ghayla, at Rafah, and at numerous smaller engagements had shown that Egyptian troops could fight stubbornly when properly positioned. The defeat had 4 primary causes, and each one was structural. The first was the loss of air superiority. Everything in the Six-Day War, every ground engagement on every front, had been shaped by the fact that the Israeli Air Force owned the sky from the first morning. Egyptian ground forces had fought without air cover, without air reconnaissance, and under constant air attack. No army in the world, regardless of its size or the quality of its equipment, could sustain offensive or even defensive operations under those conditions. This was the single most important lesson, of 1967, and it dictated the most consequential decision of Egypt's military rebuilding, the decision to build a dense, layered air defense system that could provide ground forces with protection from air attack, even without achieving air superiority in the conventional sense. The air defense system that Egypt constructed between 1968 and 1973 was built around Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles, SA-2 Guideline and SA-3 Goa fixed-site missiles, complemented by the mobile SA-6 Gainful, which could move with advancing ground forces. These were layered with radar-guided anti-aircraft artillery, particularly the ZSU-23 Forshilka, a tracked vehicle carrying 4 rapid-firing 23mm cannon linked to an onboard radar. The concept was to create an integrated air defense umbrella that would be so dense and so lethal that Israeli aircraft could not operate over the battlefield with the freedom they had enjoyed in 1967. The umbrella would not need to shoot down every Israeli plane. It would need to impose a cost, in aircraft lost and pilots killed, high enough to deter the kind of sustained close air support that had been decisive in the Sinai, the West Bank, and the Golan. This was not a theoretical exercise. Egypt deployed this system along the Suez Canal during the War of Attrition between 1968 and 1970, and it worked. Israeli aircraft that had operated over the canal zone with impunity in 1967 began taking losses. Phantoms and Skyhawks, the American aircraft that had replaced the French Mirages and Mystères as the backbone of the IAF, were being shot down by SA-2 and SA-3 missiles at rates that were unsustainable. The Israelis adapted with electronic countermeasures and changed tactics, but the air defense problem was never fully solved before the 1970 ceasefire. The Egyptians noticed. They had found the counter to Israeli air superiority, not by building a better air force, but by building a ground-based system that could deny the Israelis the airspace over the battlefield. The second structural failure identified by the Egyptian analysis was the breakdown of command and communication. The centralized command system had failed catastrophically when the pace of Israeli operations exceeded the ability of senior headquarters to process information and issue orders. The Egyptian response to this was more nuanced than simply decentralizing. The political constraints that had produced the centralized system in the first place had not disappeared. The regime still needed to maintain political control over the officer corps. But within those constraints, the Egyptians worked to improve communication systems, reduce the number of command layers between frontline units and decision-making authority, and, critically, develop detailed, rehearsed battle plans that would allow units to execute their assigned tasks without constant guidance from above. This last point was central to the Egyptian approach for the next war. If Egyptian junior officers could not be trusted or trained to improvise the way Israeli officers did, then the solution was to plan every phase of the operation in such detail that improvisation would not be necessary. The crossing of the Suez Canal, the operation that would open the October 1973 war, was rehearsed hundreds of times on training grounds along the Nile. Every infantry company knew exactly which section of the canal it would cross, which sand rampart it would breach, which position it would occupy on the far bank. Engineers knew exactly where they would deploy their pontoon bridges. Anti-tank teams knew exactly where they would set up their Saga missile positions. The plan was so detailed and so thoroughly rehearsed that units could execute it almost mechanically, without requiring the kind of real-time decision-making that had been the Egyptian system's weakest point. The third failure was the inability to conduct an orderly retreat. The Egyptian analysis concluded correctly that the catastrophic losses in the Sinai had been caused less by the initial Israeli breakthrough than by the chaotic, unplanned withdrawal that followed. Units that might have fallen back to successive defensive lines and continued fighting had instead been destroyed on the roads because no withdrawal plan existed and no commander had the authority to organize one in real time. The lesson drawn from this was stark. In the next war, Egyptian forces would not attempt deep offensive operations that might outrun their command and logistics capabilities. They would cross the canal, establish a bridgehead, and hold it under the protection of the air defense umbrella. They would not try to race across the Sinai and reach the Israeli border. They would seize limited terrain, inflict casualties, and then negotiate from a position of restored dignity. The fourth failure, related to all the others, was the absence of effective combined arms coordination. The Egyptians addressed this partly through the detailed planning approach described above and partly through the massive deployment of infantry portable anti-tank weapons. In 1967, Egyptian infantry had been largely helpless against Israeli tanks. In 1973, Egyptian infantry squads would be equipped with Soviet Saga anti-tank guided missiles, wire-guided weapons that a single soldier could operate from a concealed position, capable of destroying any tank in the Israeli infantry at ranges over 1,000 meters. The proliferation of these weapons across Egyptian infantry units meant that every squad, every platoon, every company could engage Israeli armor directly without depending on its own tanks or anti-tank guns being in the right place at the right time. The cumulative effect of these changes was profound. The Egyptian military that crossed the Suez Canal on October 6, 1973, was not the same institution that had collapsed in the Sinai in 1967. It was an army that had studied its own defeat with ruthless clarity, identified the specific structural factors that had caused it, and developed specific countermeasures to address each one. The crossing itself, a massive amphibious assault across a defended water obstacle, executed at night with coordination across an entire army front, was one of the most impressive military operations of the second half of the 20th century. Egyptian infantry crossed the canal in rubber boats, scaled the sand ramparts on the Israeli-held East Bank using high-pressure water cannons to cut through the sand, and established bridgeheads that withstood Israeli counterattacks for days. The Israeli response to the October 1973 attack revealed just how dangerous the lessons of 1967 had become when treated as permanent truths. Israeli intelligence, confident in its ability to detect Arab preparations, missed or dismissed clear warning signs of the coming attack, a failure known in Israeli history as the Mehdal, the blunder. Israeli Air Force pilots, accustomed to operating with near impunity over Arab positions, flew into the dense Egyptian air defense umbrella along the Suez Canal and took devastating losses. In the first days of the war, the IAF lost over 50 aircraft, a rate of attrition that, if sustained, would have destroyed the Air Force within weeks. Israeli tank formations, trained in the aggressive armoured doctrine that had worked so brilliantly in 1967, charged into Egyptian infantry positions along the canal and were ambushed by Saga missile teams operating from concealed positions. Tank after tank was hit and destroyed. Entire battalions were mauled. The Yom Kippur War did not end in Israeli defeat. After the initial shock, the IDF adapted, found gaps in the Egyptian air defense coverage, exploited an operational error when Egyptian armor advanced beyond its missile umbrella, and mounted a dramatic crossing of the Suez Canal into Egypt proper that threatened to encircle the Egyptian Third Army. The war ended in a military stalemate and a diplomatic process that eventually produced the Camp David Accords of 1978 and the Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty of 1979. But the early days of October 1973 demonstrated with painful clarity that the Six-Day War had been a product of specific conditions that could be changed, and that the Arab militaries were capable of learning from their defeats and adapting in ways that neutralized Israeli advantages. This is the deeper lesson of the Six-Day War, and it is the lesson that transcends the specific circumstances of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Military victories, no matter how complete, are not permanent. They are the product of a specific balance of capabilities, doctrines, and structural factors at a specific moment in time. The side that wins tends to believe that its methods are universally valid, and it tends to prepare for the next war by perfecting the methods that won the last one. The side that loses is forced to innovate, to question its assumptions, and to develop new approaches specifically designed to counter the victor's strengths. In 1967, Israel's advantages in air power, combined arms coordination, junior officer initiative, and intelligence were decisive because the Arab armies had no effective countermeasures against any of them. By 1973, countermeasures existed for all of them: dense air defense networks, anti-tank missiles distributed to infantry, detailed pre-planned operations that minimized the need for real-time adaptation, and a strategic concept of limited aims that avoided the kind of overextension that had produced the 1967 collapse. The pendulum had swung, not all the way back, but far enough to shatter the illusion of invincibility. And this pattern, victory producing complacency, defeat producing adaptation, is visible across military history. from the French confidence after the First World War that produced the Maginot Line mentality, to the American experience in Vietnam, to the Soviet experience in Afghanistan. The Six-Day War is a textbook example of the phenomenon, made more dramatic by the speed and completeness of the initial victory and the severity of the subsequent correction. But there is one more dimension of the Six-Day War that deserves examination before we draw final conclusions, and it concerns something that is often overlooked in military analyses focused on hardware, doctrine, and command structures. It concerns the role of political leadership in shaping military outcomes, not just in the decision to go to war, but in the way political constraints shape military planning, military options, and the ultimate consequences of military action. Because the Six-Day War was not simply a military event, it was a political event with military dimensions, and the political decisions that preceded, accompanied, and followed the fighting shaped its character and consequences as much as any tactical innovation or operational maneuver. The political dimension of the Six-Day War begins not in June 1967, but in the months and years before it, in the decisions made by leaders on all sides that narrowed the range of options until war became effectively unavoidable. Understanding those decisions is essential because they reveal a pattern that recurs throughout military history, the pattern of political leaders who escalate crises for domestic or ideological reasons without fully controlling the military consequences of that escalation. Gamal Abdel Nasser did not want a war in June 1967. This is a statement that surprises many people who encounter it for the first time, because Nasser's public rhetoric in the weeks before the war was so aggressive, so inflammatory, and so explicitly directed at Israel's destruction that it seems impossible he was not seeking a fight. But the evidence, from Egyptian military planning documents, from the accounts of Nasser's inner circle, and from the assessments of both Israeli and American intelligence at the time, suggests that Nasser was engaged in a campaign of coercive diplomacy, not a preparation for war. He was using military mobilization and rhetorical escalation to achieve political objectives, specifically to reassert his leadership of the Arab world, to demonstrate solidarity with Syria, and to extract diplomatic concessions without actually intending to fire the first shot. The crisis that led to the war began with Syria, not Egypt. Throughout 1966 and into early 1967, Syrian-sponsored guerrilla raids into Israel from the Golan Heights had been escalating. Israel responded with increasingly forceful military reprisals, including an air battle over Syria in April 1967, in which the Israeli Air Force shot down 6 Syrian MiG-21s, some of them over the outskirts of Damascus. The humiliation was severe. Syria appealed to Egypt for support under their mutual defense treaty. Nasser, who had been criticized by the Syrians and by other Arab voices for hiding behind the UN peacekeeping force in the Sinai while Syria bore the brunt of Israeli retaliation, felt compelled to respond. His credibility as the leader of the Arab world was at stake. The sequence of moves that followed had a logic that was political rather than military. Nasser moved troops into the Sinai, not because he had a plan to attack Israel, but because the visible deployment of Egyptian forces would demonstrate solidarity with Syria and re-establish his credentials as the champion of the Arab cause. He demanded the withdrawal of the UN emergency force for the same reason. It was a dramatic gesture that would play well on the Arab street. Each move was calibrated to raise the temperature without crossing the line into actual combat. But the closure of the Straits of Tiran on May 22nd was the step that crossed that line. Nasser may not have fully appreciated how Israel would interpret this action. For Egypt, the Straits were a useful pressure point, a way to demonstrate resolve without firing a shot. For Israel, the closure was an existential threat, and a casus belli that had been explicitly stated as such for over a decade. The Israeli port of Eilat depended on access through the Straits for its oil imports and its trade with East Africa and Asia. Closing the Straits was, in Israeli strategic doctrine, functionally equivalent to a declaration of war. Once the Straits were closed, Nasser was trapped by his own escalation. He could not reopen them without appearing to back down under Israeli pressure, which would destroy his political standing in the Arab world. He could not keep them closed without provoking the very war he was trying to avoid. And the longer the crisis continued, the more his rhetoric escalated, the more pressure he faced from his own military and from other Arab leaders to follow through on his threats. The Mutual Defense Pact with Jordan, signed on May 30th, was another step in this escalation, a political gesture that had the military consequence of surrounding Israel with hostile forces on 3 fronts and making preemptive Israeli action more likely, not less. King Hussein's decision to join the pact and subsequently to enter the war was shaped by a different set of political pressures, but followed the same pattern of political logic overriding military calculation. Hussein understood that his army could not defeat Israel. His military advisors told him so directly. But he also understood that if Egypt and Syria went to war and Jordan stayed out, the consequences for his regime could be fatal. The large Palestinian population in Jordan, already restive, already sympathetic to the PLO, would view Jordanian neutrality as a betrayal. Other Arab leaders would condemn him as a traitor. His throne, always precarious, might not survive the political fallout of standing aside while Arab armies fought Israel. So Hussein joined an alliance he knew was militarily unwise, based on political calculations that proved disastrous. The false reports from Cairo on the morning of June 5th, claiming Egyptian victories that did not exist, may have reinforced his decision to open fire, but the fundamental choice had already been made, and the result was the loss of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, territories that Jordan would never recover. On the Israeli side, the political dynamics were different but equally consequential. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol was not a hawk. He was a cautious, pragmatic politician who had spent the weeks of crisis seeking a diplomatic solution. He appealed to the United States and to the United Nations for intervention. He explored the possibility of an international naval force to reopen the Straits of Tiran. He delayed military action as long as he could, even as his generals pressed for authorization to strike, and his own public accused him of weakness. The pressure on Eshkol came from multiple directions. The military leadership, led by Chief of Staff Rabin and the operational commanders, argued with increasing urgency that delay was dangerous. Every day of mobilization cost Israel economically and wore down the reservists who were sitting in staging areas waiting for orders. More importantly, the military argued that the window for a successful preemptive strike was narrowing. Egyptian forces in the Sinai were digging in, improving their positions and receiving reinforcements. The longer Israel waited, the costlier the attack would be. Rabin himself was so consumed by the stress of the crisis that he suffered a temporary collapse on May 23rd and was briefly incapacitated, a fact that was kept from the public at the time. The political pressure was equally intense. The Israeli public, gripped by genuine fear, demanded a government that projected strength. The formation of a national unity government on June 1st, bringing in Moshe Dayan as defense minister and Menachem Begin as minister without portfolio, was a political response to this pressure. Dayan's appointment in particular was a signal, both to the Israeli public and to the Arab states, that the government was prepared to act. Once Dayan was in the cabinet, the political dynamic shifted decisively toward war. The American role in the political build-up was ambiguous and ultimately permissive. President Lyndon Johnson, consumed by the Vietnam War and unwilling to commit American forces to another conflict, urged Israel to show restraint and sought to organize an international response to the strait's closure. But the diplomatic efforts went nowhere. The British, whom Johnson hoped would co-sponsor a multilateral naval initiative, were unenthusiastic. The UN Security Council was paralyzed by the Soviet veto, and the private signals that Washington sent to Israel, through intelligence channels and diplomatic back-channels, were interpreted by the Israeli leadership as a tacit green light. Johnson would not publicly endorse an Israeli first strike, but he would not oppose one, and he would ensure that the Soviet Union did not intervene directly on the Arab side. This political context matters because it shaped the military campaign in ways that are often invisible in tactical narratives. Israel's decision to strike Egypt first and massively, while initially restraining operations against Jordan and Syria, was not purely a military calculation about which threat was most dangerous. It was also a political calculation about international legitimacy. Destroying the Egyptian Air Force could be justified as a defensive response to the closure of the straits and the massing of Egyptian forces in the Sinai. Attacking Jordan and Syria preemptively would be harder to justify unless they struck first. Hence the message to Hussein, "Stay out, and we will not attack," which was sincere in its intent, but overtaken by events when Jordanian artillery opened fire on West Jerusalem. The decision to attack the Golan Heights on the war's 5th day was similarly shaped by political as well as military considerations. Dayan's initial reluctance was partly military. The terrain was terrible and casualties would be high, but also partly political. He was concerned that attacking Syria would provoke Soviet intervention. By June 9th, the political calculus had shifted. The speed of the victories on the other fronts had changed the international dynamic. The Soviet Union was angry but not prepared to intervene militarily. The United Nations was moving toward a ceasefire, but it had not yet imposed one. And the domestic political pressure to deal with the Syrian artillery threat, the pressure from the farming communities of the Galilee, from Northern Command, from the general public, was overwhelming. Dayan gave the order, and the window was just wide enough to complete the operation before the ceasefire took effect. The political shaping of military action continued after the fighting stopped. The Israeli government's decisions about what to do with the conquered territories were political decisions with profound strategic consequences. The immediate annexation of East Jerusalem, implemented within weeks of the war's end, was a political act driven by historical and religious sentiment as much as by strategic calculation. The decision not to annex the West Bank and Gaza, but to administer them as occupied territories, was a political compromise that left all options theoretically open, but in practice created a situation that became progressively harder to resolve. The settlement enterprise, which began almost immediately and accelerated over the following decades, was a political project driven by ideological constituencies within Israeli politics, but it had direct military consequences. Each settlement required a security infrastructure, roads, fences, guard posts, patrol routes, and dedicated military units to protect them. The deeper the settlements penetrated into the occupied territories, the more military resources were required to defend them, and the more entangled the military became in the daily administration of a hostile civilian population. The IDF, which had been designed as a fast-moving offensive force optimized for short, decisive wars, increasingly found itself performing police functions in the territories, manning checkpoints, conducting house searches, suppressing demonstrations, and guarding isolated settlements. This was a fundamentally different mission from the one the army was built for, and it imposed costs, in training time, morale, and institutional focus, that would compound over decades. The broader political legacy of the Six-Day War was a hardening of positions on all sides that made peace progressively more difficult. Israel's territorial gains gave it bargaining leverage but also created constituencies, both within Israel and among its international supporters, that opposed trading any of that territory for peace. The Arab world's humiliation produced a determination to undo the results of the war, whether through military means, as in 1973, or through diplomatic pressure, guerrilla warfare, and eventually the Palestinian intifadas of 1987 and 2000. The Palestinians, now living under direct Israeli occupation, rather than Jordanian or Egyptian administration, developed their own national movement with its own demands and its own methods, adding a new layer of complexity to a conflict that had already defied resolution. The Six-Day War demonstrated that military excellence, no matter how impressive, cannot substitute for political strategy. Israel won the war with remarkable efficiency, but it won without a plan for what to do with the victory. The territory was seized faster than any political framework could be developed to deal with it, and in the absence of such a framework, the military victory created political problems that proved far more intractable than the military challenges it had solved. This is not a uniquely Israeli dilemma. It is a recurring pattern in military history, the gap between tactical success and strategic outcome, between winning the war and winning the peace. And it is a pattern that the Six-Day War illustrates with unusual clarity, precisely because the military victory was so complete and the political aftermath so unresolved. There is a tendency, when studying a war as dramatic and decisive as the Six-Day War, to focus on the most spectacular moments: the destruction of the Egyptian Air Force, the paratroopers at the Western Wall, the storming of the Golan Heights, and to treat the outcome as the product of those climactic events. But the real determinants of the war's outcome were not the moments of peak drama. They were the years of unglamorous, invisible preparation that preceded those moments. And this is the aspect of the Six-Day War that offers the most enduring lessons for anyone interested in understanding how wars are actually won and lost. Consider what went into Operation Moked before a single aircraft left the ground on June 5th. The Israeli Air Force spent the better part of a decade preparing for that morning. Pilots flew practice sorties against mock airfield targets in the Negev desert thousands of times. They practiced low-altitude flight profiles over the Mediterranean until the navigation was instinctive. Ground crews drilled turnaround procedures, refueling, rearming, inspecting, and relaunching an aircraft, until they could do it in under 8 minutes, consistently, under simulated combat conditions. Intelligence officers built and continuously updated a target file for every Arab airfield, incorporating new aerial photography, signals intelligence, and human source reporting as it became available. Weapons engineers tested and refined the runway penetration bombs to ensure they would crater the specific types of concrete and asphalt used on Egyptian runways. Logisticians calculated fuel consumption, bomb loads, and sortie rates down to the individual aircraft, ensuring that the right weapons would be at the right base at the right time for each wave of strikes. None of this was glamorous. None of it produced dramatic footage or memorable quotations. But without it, Mukt would have been a gamble rather than a calculated operation. The difference between a successful preemptive strike and a catastrophic failure is not boldness. It is preparation. The Israeli pilots who flew into Egypt on June 5th were not braver than the Egyptian pilots they caught on the ground. They were better prepared, and their preparation was the product of an institutional culture that treated readiness as a continuous process rather than a periodic exercise. The same principle applied on the ground. Sharon's night assault on Abu Agela was a masterpiece of combined arms coordination, but it did not spring from Sharon's tactical genius alone. It was built on a foundation of training and doctrine that extended far below the division commander's level. The engineers who cleared lanes through the minefields in darkness had practiced mine clearance under simulated fire hundreds of times. The infantry squads that fought through the Egyptian trenches had trained in close-quarters battle techniques that were standard across the IDF. The paratroopers who landed behind the Egyptian artillery had rehearsed helicopter assaults in similar terrain. The tank crews that engaged the dug-in T-34s on the northern ridge had fired thousands of rounds in gunnery exercises against similar targets. Each individual element of Sharon's plan was executable, because the units assigned to execute it had been trained to a standard that made execution reliable. This is what military professionals mean when they talk about the difference between a plan and an operation. A plan is a document. An operation is the execution of that document by human beings under conditions of extreme stress, confusion, physical danger, and fatigue. The gap between the two is bridged by training, specifically by training that is realistic enough, repetitive enough, and demanding enough that the required actions become reflexive rather than deliberative. Under the conditions of actual combat, when men are exhausted and frightened and the noise is deafening and the information is incomplete, there is no time for deliberation. Units either fall back on trained responses or they improvise, and improvisation under extreme stress is unreliable. The Israeli military in 1967 had achieved a level of training that made its operations unusually reliable for an army of its size. This was partly a function of the conscription and reserve system. The same men trained together year after year, building unit cohesion and tactical proficiency that could not be matched by armies with higher turnover. It was partly a function of institutional culture, the IDF's after-action review process, in which every engagement was analysed honestly and critically, with mistakes identified and corrective measures implemented, was far more rigorous than anything in the Arab armies, and it was partly a function of necessity. Israel could not afford to lose a war. It could not absorb the casualties that a poorly executed operation would produce. The margin for error was too small, and the consequences of failure were too severe. This existential pressure, however uncomfortable, produced an intensity of preparation that larger, less threatened armies often lacked. The logistics of the Six-Day War illustrate this principle in a different dimension. The Israeli attack plan required the simultaneous mobilization and deployment of virtually the entire national military force. 3 divisions for the Sinai, forces for Jerusalem and the West Bank, a division equivalent for the Golan, plus the Air Force operations. All of this had to be supplied with fuel, ammunition, food, water, spare parts, and medical support. For a country the size of New Jersey, with limited rail infrastructure and a road network that could be disrupted by a single air attack, the logistical challenge was immense. The IDF addressed this through pre-positioning and detailed planning. Ammunition stockpiles were distributed across multiple depots near the likely staging areas. Fuel supplies were pre-positioned along the expected axes of advance. Medical evacuation routes were planned and rehearsed. Maintenance units were assigned to specific formations and knew exactly where to position themselves relative to the advancing combat units. Water, a critical resource in desert warfare, was stockpiled in quantities calculated against the expected rate of advance and the number of troops and vehicles that would need supply. None of this was visible to the outside world. International observers who marvelled at the speed of the Israeli advance through the Sinai tended to attribute it to the fighting spirit of the tank crews and the tactical brilliance of the division commanders. They rarely considered that the advance was only possible because fuel trucks were arriving at the right locations at the right times, because ammunition resupply was keeping pace with expenditure rates, and because broken-down vehicles were being recovered and repaired fast enough to maintain the combat strength of the advancing units. An armoured division that runs out of fuel or ammunition stops advancing regardless of how brave or brilliant its commander is. The Israeli divisions did not run out because the logistical system behind them worked, and it worked because it had been planned and rehearsed with the same intensity as the combat operations themselves. Compare this with the Egyptian logistical performance. The Egyptian forces in the Sinai were well supplied in their fixed defensive positions. They had ample ammunition, fuel and food in their prepared fortifications, but the logistical system was designed for a static defence, not for movement. When the defence collapsed and units had to withdraw, there was no logistical plan for a mobile retreat. Fuel dumps were abandoned or destroyed. Ammunition stocks were left behind. Water supplies that had been laboriously transported to forward positions were lost. The retreating Egyptian forces were not just fleeing Israeli tanks, they were outrunning their own logistics, and the result was units that ran out of fuel, ran out of water, and were stranded in the open desert with no ability to sustain themselves. The logistical asymmetry was not a failure of resources. Egypt had plenty of supplies. It was a failure of planning and organisational flexibility, the same structural weakness that manifested in command rigidity, information distortion, and the inability to adapt to changing conditions. And it reinforces the central argument about the Six-Day War, that the outcome was determined not by the courage or cowardice of individuals, not by the superiority of one nation over another, but by the relative effectiveness of two different organisational systems under the stress of actual combat. This brings us to the question of what the Six-Day War can teach us about military effectiveness in general, lessons that apply beyond the specific context of the Arab-Israeli conflict, beyond the specific decade of the 1960s, and beyond the specific technologies that were employed. The first lesson is that military effectiveness is primarily an organisational achievement, not a technological one. The weapons used in the Six-Day War were not, in most cases, dramatically superior on one side. Israeli Centurion tanks were good, but Egyptian T-54s and T-55s were also capable vehicles. Israeli Mirage 3s were excellent fighters, but Egyptian MiG-21s were comparable in many performance parameters. The difference was not in the machines, but in the organisations that operated them, in the training of the crews, the quality of the maintenance, the efficiency of the logistics, and the responsiveness of the command systems. A well-trained crew in a mediocre tank will outperform a poorly trained crew in a superior tank almost every time. The Six-Day War demonstrated this repeatedly. The second lesson is that initiative at the junior level is a decisive multiplier. Armies that empower their lieutenants and captains to make decisions in contact with the enemy will consistently outperform armies that require those decisions to be made by colonels and generals at distant headquarters. This is not a cultural statement about national character. It is an organisational design choice with measurable consequences on the battlefield. The Israeli military chose to tolerate the risks of decentralised decision-making, the occasional bad call by an overly aggressive lieutenant, the occasional breach of the overall plan by a company commander who saw an opportunity, because the benefits of speed and responsiveness far outweighed those risks. The Egyptian and Syrian militaries chose centralised control because the political risks of empowering junior officers outweighed the military benefits. Both were rational choices given their respective political contexts, but in combat the decentralised system had an enormous advantage. The third lesson is that intelligence is only as valuable as the command system that acts on it. Israeli intelligence before the Six-Day War was superb, detailed, accurate, and continuously updated. But intelligence alone does not win wars. What wins wars is the ability to translate intelligence into operational decisions faster than the enemy can react. The Israeli command system could process intelligence and translate it into action within hours, sometimes minutes. Arab command systems took days to process the same kind of information, and by the time decisions were made, the situation had changed. The speed of the decision cycle, what modern military theorists call the OODA loop for observe, orient, decide, act, was as important as the quality of the information itself. The fourth lesson, and perhaps the most important, is that victory is perishable. The conditions that produce a decisive military victory at one point in time can be neutralized, countered, or reversed by an adaptive opponent. The Six-Day War appeared to establish Israeli military supremacy as a permanent fact. 6 years later, that supremacy was challenged by enemies who had studied the Israeli method, identified its vulnerabilities, and developed specific countermeasures. The air defense umbrella of 1973 was a direct response to the air superiority of 1967. The Saga missile teams were a direct response to the armoured dominance of 1967. The Canal Crossing Plan was a direct response to the command failures of 1967. Each Israeli advantage was met with a specific counter, and the result was a war that very nearly went the other way. The Six-Day War, studied honestly, is not a story of inherent superiority. It is a story of one side being better prepared than the other at a specific moment, and of the consequences, both positive and negative, that flowed from that temporary advantage. The military victory was real and earned. The strategic and political consequences were ambiguous and enduring. And the lessons, properly understood, are as much about the limits of military force as about its power. The Six-Day War occupies a peculiar position in military history. It is simultaneously one of the most studied and one of the most misunderstood conflicts of the 20th century. It is studied because the results were so dramatic. A war decided in hours, 3 armies defeated in days, a map redrawn in less than a week. It is misunderstood because the drama of the outcome encourages explanations that emphasize the exceptional rather than the structural, the heroic rather than the institutional, the miraculous rather than the methodical. We have traced the structural factors that produced the outcome, the years of Air Force preparation that made Moked possible, the training and doctrine that enabled combined arms operations like Abu Aghala, the reserve mobilization system that allowed a small country to field a large and cohesive military force on short notice, the intelligence apparatus that provided Israeli commanders with a detailed and accurate picture of their opponents, and the command culture that empowered junior leaders to act decisively under pressure. We have also traced the structural weaknesses on the Arab side, the centralized command systems that could not adapt to rapidly changing conditions, the politicization of the officer corps that discouraged initiative, the information distortions that prevented accurate assessments from reaching decision-makers, and the logistical rigidity that could sustain a static defense but not a mobile retreat. But there is one final dimension of the Six-Day War that deserves attention, because it connects the specific events of June 1967 to a broader pattern in the history of warfare, the relationship between military doctrine and the political context in which that doctrine is developed and employed. Every military doctrine is, at its core, a theory about how to convert national resources into military outcomes. It reflects assumptions about the nature of the threat, the character of the battlefield, the capabilities of the enemy, and the political objectives that military force is meant to achieve. Good doctrine matches these assumptions to reality. Bad doctrine is built on assumptions that are outdated, wishful, or politically convenient rather than operationally sound. Israeli doctrine in 1967 was exceptionally well matched to the reality it faced. The emphasis on preemption reflected the genuine strategic vulnerability of a small country with no territorial depth. The emphasis on speed and offensive action reflected the economic reality that a reserve-based military could not sustain prolonged mobilization. The emphasis on combined arms coordination and junior leader initiative reflected the understanding that Israel's forces would always be outnumbered and would need qualitative advantages to compensate. And the emphasis on air superiority as the precondition for ground operations reflected the lesson of modern warfare, established repeatedly since 1940, that ground forces operating without air cover are at a crippling disadvantage. Each element of this doctrine was tested in June 1967, and each element performed as designed. The doctrine worked because it was built on honest assessment of Israeli strengths and weaknesses, accurate intelligence about enemy capabilities, and realistic evaluation of the operational environment. It was not built on ideology, wishful thinking, or political convenience. It was built on the hard-headed recognition that Israel's margin for error was essentially zero, and that only meticulous preparation could compensate for the numerical and geographical disadvantages it faced. Arab military doctrine in 1967, by contrast, was mismatched to the reality of the battlefield in ways that its practitioners did not fully recognize until the war exposed them. Egyptian defensive doctrine in the Sinai was based on Soviet models that assumed a different kind of war, a war of large-scale, sustained operations between industrialized states with deep reserves of manpower and material. The Soviet doctrine was designed for the European theatre, where the distances were shorter, the infrastructure was denser, and the armies were much larger. Transplanted to the Sinai, a vast, sparsely developed desert with limited road networks and extreme climate conditions, the doctrine's assumptions about communication, resupply, and command responsiveness did not hold. Syrian doctrine on the Golan suffered from a different version of the same problem. The fortifications were individually impressive, well-engineered, solidly constructed, and positioned on excellent terrain. But the defensive system as a whole was brittle because it depended on a command structure that could not tolerate disruption. When the forward positions were breached and the false report about Qunetra's fall circulated, the entire system collapsed, not because the fortifications had been overwhelmed, but because the organizational framework that connected them disintegrated. A defensive system is only as strong as the command network that coordinates it, and the Syrian command network was designed for centralized control under conditions of stability, not for distributed resilience under conditions of chaos. The doctrinal mismatch was compounded by a training gap that was itself a product of political choices. Training an army to execute complex operations under realistic conditions requires a willingness to expose units to failure, to run exercises that are hard enough that some units fail so that weaknesses can be identified and corrected. The Israeli military embraced this approach. Exercises were designed to be stressful, unpredictable, and revealing. After-action reviews were conducted with brutal honesty. Officers who performed poorly were identified and sometimes removed. The institutional culture accepted short-term embarrassment as the price of long-term effectiveness. In the Egyptian and Syrian militaries, this kind of training was politically problematic. Exercises that revealed unit failures also revealed the failures of the commanders who led those units. Commanders who often held their positions because of political connections rather than professional competence. Honest after-action reviews that identified systemic problems risked embarrassing senior leaders or worse, suggesting that the military was not as capable as the regime publicly claimed. The result was training that was more ceremonial than operational. Large-scale exercises that looked impressive but did not subject units to the kind of realistic stress that would have exposed their weaknesses before those weaknesses became fatal on the battlefield. This training gap was not invisible to everyone on the Arab side. Individual officers within the Egyptian and Syrian militaries recognized the problems and argued for reform. Some of these officers would play crucial roles in the post-1967 rebuilding effort, but before the war their voices were marginalized by a political system that valued loyalty over competence and optimistic reporting over honest assessment. It took the shock of catastrophic defeat to create the political space for the reforms that these officers had been advocating. The connection between political systems and military effectiveness is the thread that runs through the entire story of the Six-Day War. Democracies do not automatically produce better armies than authoritarian states. History provides numerous counterexamples. But political systems that tolerate honest internal criticism, that promote leaders based on competence rather than loyalty, that allow institutions to learn from failure without punishing the messengers, and that maintain a realistic relationship between public rhetoric and actual capability. These systems tend to produce military organizations that are more adaptive, more resilient, and more effective under the stress of actual combat. Israel in 1967 was not a perfect democracy, and its military was not free of political influence. But the IDF operated within a political culture that valued practical results over ideological conformity, that tolerated, even encouraged, argument and debate within the officer corps, and that maintained a relatively transparent relationship between the military establishment and the civilian government. Officers could disagree with their superiors, challenge assumptions, and propose alternatives without risking their careers or their lives. This does not sound dramatic, and it does not make for compelling cinema, but it is the foundation on which military effectiveness is built, and its absence in the Arab militaries of 1967 was as important a factor in the outcome as any weapon system or tactical innovation. The Six-Day War also carries a cautionary lesson about the relationship between military victory and political wisdom. Israel's military performance in June 1967 was, by almost any professional standard, superb. The planning was meticulous, the execution was aggressive and adaptive, and the results were decisive. But military excellence did not translate into political clarity. The government that fought the war so effectively had no coherent plan for what to do with the territories it conquered. The result was a set of improvised decisions: the annexation of Jerusalem, the beginning of the settlement enterprise, the indefinite military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, that created a political situation far more complex and intractable than the military problem the war had solved. This is not a moral judgment, it is a strategic observation. Wars are fought for political purposes, and a war that achieves its military objectives but fails to produce a viable political outcome has, in a meaningful sense, failed to achieve its ultimate purpose. The Six-Day War eliminated the immediate military threat to Israel's existence, but it created a new set of problems: the occupation, the settlements, the Palestinian national movement, the international isolation, that would consume Israeli strategic attention and resources for generations. The generals who planned and fought the Six-Day War did their job brilliantly. The political leaders who had to deal with the consequences of that victory found themselves in a situation for which no amount of military preparation had equipped them. And this gap, between what military force can achieve and what political leadership must then manage, is perhaps the most important lesson the Six-Day War has to offer. On the evening of June 10th, 1967, as the ceasefire settled over the Golan Heights and the last shots faded across the Suez Canal, the state of Israel found itself in a position that no one, not its leaders, not its generals, not its citizens, and certainly not its enemies, had fully anticipated 6 days earlier. A country that had feared for its survival now controlled territory that dwarfed its original borders. 3 armies that had promised its destruction were shattered, their equipment scattered across the Sinai, the West Bank, and the volcanic slopes of the Golan. The most powerful Arab air forces in the region had been wiped out in a single morning. The strategic map of the Middle East had been redrawn in less time than most nations take to conduct a single military exercise. The numbers tell part of the story. In 6 days, the Israeli Air Force flew over 3,000 sorties and destroyed more than 400 Arab aircraft, while losing 46 of its own. Israeli ground forces conquered the Sinai Peninsula, an area of over 23,000 square miles, in roughly 4 days. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem, was taken in 3 days. The Golan Heights, the most heavily fortified position in the entire theatre, fell in approximately 27 hours of actual combat. Combined Arab casualties exceeded 15,000 killed, with tens of thousands more wounded and roughly 6,000 taken prisoner. Israel lost approximately 776 killed and over 2,500 wounded. Grievous losses for a nation of fewer than 3 million people, but a fraction of what had been feared when the crisis began. But numbers alone cannot convey the significance of what happened. The Six-Day War was not simply a military engagement. It was a demonstration of what happens when institutional preparation meets institutional failure. When one side has spent years honestly assessing its own vulnerabilities and building systems to compensate for them, while the other side has spent the same years building military institutions that serve political purposes rather than operational ones. The Israeli victory was not produced by a single factor. It was the cumulative product of many factors, each one the result of deliberate organizational choices made over many years. The Air Force turnaround times that turned 200 aircraft into 800 daily sorties. The intelligence apparatus that provided target quality information on every Arab airfield, fortification, and unit deployment. The reserve mobilization system that could put 250,000 trained soldiers into the field within 72 hours. The command culture that empowered a company commander to adapt his approach when the plan met reality, without waiting for permission from a distant headquarters. The logistical system that kept fuel, ammunition, and water flowing to advancing formations across hundreds of miles of desert. The doctrinal framework that integrated air power, armour, infantry, artillery and engineers into coherent operations at every level from battalion to theatre. Each of these factors, taken individually, was a modest advantage. None of them alone would have been decisive, but combined, and operating against opponents whose corresponding systems were weaker in each of these same dimensions, they produced an outcome that looked, from the outside, like a miracle. It was not a miracle. It was the result of preparation so thorough that it transformed what should have been a desperate fight for survival into a controlled, sequential destruction of 3 separate enemies in less than a week. The Arab side of the equation is equally instructive, and it deserves to be understood with the same analytical seriousness, rather than dismissed as simple incompetence. The Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian militaries of 1967 were not incompetent organizations staffed by incapable people. They were organizations shaped by political systems that imposed specific constraints on how they could train, how they could organize, how they could promote leaders, and how they could process and communicate information. Those constraints produced armies that were effective at certain things. The Jordanian defense of Ammunition Hill demonstrated real tactical skill and courage, and the Egyptian fortifications at Abu Agela were expertly constructed, but fatally weak at others. The inability to adapt to unexpected developments, the distortion of information as it moved up and down the chain of command, the absence of effective combined arms coordination under combat conditions, and the logistical inflexibility that turned retreat into catastrophe. These were not random failures. They were the predictable consequences of specific organizational choices made under specific political pressures. Understanding this is important because it prevents 2 equally misleading interpretations of the war. The first is the triumphalist interpretation, that Israel won because of inherent national qualities, fighting spirit, or divine favor, and that the victory proves some permanent superiority that will always produce the same result. The Yom Kippur War of 1973 definitively refuted this interpretation. The second is the defeatist interpretation, that the Arab armies lost because of inherent cultural or national deficiencies that cannot be overcome. The Egyptian performance in 1973, particularly the Canal crossing, refuted this interpretation just as definitively. The Egyptian military that crossed the Suez Canal under fire in October 1973 was composed of the same Egyptian soldiers from the same Egyptian society as the army that had collapsed in the Sinai 6 years earlier. What changed was the institution, its doctrine, its training, its planning, its equipment, and its leadership. The 6-day war, properly understood, is a case study in the decisive importance of military institutions, how they are built, how they learn, how they adapt, and how they perform under the specific conditions of the wars they are asked to fight. The war's outcome was not predetermined by geography, demographics, or national character. It was determined by organizational choices, thousands of them, made over years by officers, planners, trainers, logisticians, and political leaders whose names will never appear in any dramatic account of the war but whose work made the outcome possible. There is a moment, early in the morning of June 5, 1967, that captures this truth more clearly than any speech or any monument. It happens not in the cockpit of a Mirage streaking toward Egypt at 50 feet above the Mediterranean. It happens on the tarmac of an Israeli airbase, where a ground crew chief is standing beside a concrete revetment with a stopwatch, timing his crew as they refuel and rearm a fighter bomber that has just returned from its first sortie. The crew moves with practiced precision, fuel hoses connected, bomb racks loaded, cannon ammunition belts fed into the weapons bays, a quick visual inspection of the airframe, a thumbs up to the pilot. 7 minutes and 43 seconds. The aircraft taxis back to the runway and launches toward its second target of the morning. That ground crew chief will never be famous. His name will not appear in the histories. No documentary will feature his photograph. But his 7 minutes and 43 seconds, multiplied across every airbase in Israel, multiplied across every sortie of that first day, produced the force multiplication that made Mokt viable. His stopwatch was as much a weapon of the 6-day war as any bomb or cannon, and his years of drilling, practicing, and refining, the unglamorous, invisible, institutional work of turning a procedure into a reflex, was as much a cause of the war's outcome as any general's brilliance or any pilot's courage. That is the real story of the 6-day war. Not a story of miracles, but a story of preparation. Not a story of supermen, but a story of systems. Not a story of one side's inherent superiority, but a story of what happens when one side builds institutions that are honest about their own weaknesses and relentless about addressing them. while the other side builds institutions that serve political needs at the expense of operational effectiveness. The territory conquered in those 6 days remains contested to this day. The political questions the war raised, the status of Jerusalem, the future of the Palestinian people, the borders of Israel, the relationship between military power and political legitimacy, remain unresolved. The military lessons the war taught have been studied, adapted, countered, and relearned in every subsequent conflict in the region and beyond. And the fundamental insight at the war's core, that wars are won and lost in the years before they are fought, in the training grounds and logistics depots and planning rooms where institutional habits are formed, remains as valid today as it was on the morning of June 5, 1967. If this documentary gave you a deeper understanding of the Six-Day War and the forces that shaped its outcome, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment with your thoughts. Your engagement helps us continue producing detailed, research-driven military history content. The Sinai has been returned to Egypt. The Golan remains under Israeli control. Jerusalem remains divided in fact, if not in law. The West Bank remains occupied. The settlements continue to expand. The peace that the war was supposed to make possible remains elusive, and the ground crew chief's stopwatch sitting in a drawer somewhere has long since stopped ticking. But the lesson it represents, that victory belongs to those who prepare for it with honesty, discipline, and relentless institutional effort, endures. It is the most important lesson the Six-Day War has to offer, and it is the one most frequently overlooked in favour of more dramatic explanations. Wars are not won by heroes alone. They are won by institutions that produce heroes and then give those heroes the tools, the training, the information, and the organisational support they need to do what is asked of them. The Six-Day War proved this beyond any reasonable doubt. What nations and armies choose to do with that proof is another question entirely, and it is a question that history continues to ask, and that we continue, imperfectly, to answer.